Plato's noble lie and collapse. Plato once wrote about something he called the noble lie, a story told by rulers to keep society stable. At first glance, it sounds harmless, even clever, like a myth designed to give people a sense of unity. He suggested that if everyone believed they were born from the same soil, bound by a shared origin, then society would function smoothly. But here is the chilling part. What Plato offered as a stabilizing myth could actually be the same mechanism that drives civilizations into collapse. Think about it. A lie is only noble if it works. If people buy into it. The moment it cracks, the moment people begin to see through it, the trust that holds everything together evaporates. And what is civilization really? If not a massive web of shared stories we all agree to believe in. Money only works because we collectively believe it has value. Governments only function because people agree that laws are binding. Even morality is a shared framework we accept without proof. Now imagine one of those stories collapsing. Imagine the noble lie breaking down. What happens then? Here is where the shock hits. Collapse does not begin with hunger or war or even pandemics. It begins when belief erodes. The Roman Empire did not fall just because of outside invasions. It rotted from within when people no longer trusted the system that once gave their lives meaning. They stopped believing in the story. In the modern world, we are surrounded by noble lies. They tell us that progress is endless, that technology will save us, that our leaders know what they are doing. And yet deep down, many people are starting to suspect these promises are empty. That endless growth is impossible. That technology creates as many problems as it solves. That leaders are improvising just as much as the rest of us. Once enough people stop believing, collapse is not a question of if, but when. This is not just theory. Psychologists have studied how fragile collective trust really is. There is a phenomenon called social proof. Humans look to others to decide what is true or trustworthy. If everyone else seems to believe, we believe too. But once doubt spreads, once cracks appear, it cascades. It is like a run on a bank. The money is fine as long as everyone trusts it is there. The moment enough people panic and withdraw, the whole thing crumbles overnight. The noble lie works exactly the same way. And once it fails, you cannot glue it back together. But here is the cruel irony. Lies are not just told by elites to manipulate people. They are told by all of us, to ourselves. We convince ourselves that our daily routines matter in the big picture, that working longer hours will buy security, that our systems are stable because they have always been stable. These are our personal noble lies. And when they fail, individuals experience their own collapse. Anxiety, depression, even existential crises often begin when someone realizes the story they built their life on is not true. Multiply that by millions of people, and you get a culture that no longer believes in its own foundation. You might be thinking, maybe that is a good thing. Maybe we need to shed illusions. But history tells a darker story. When shared myths collapse, they are rarely replaced by rational truths. Instead, they are replaced by chaos, extremism, or blind faith in something even more dangerous. After the noble lie of Rome fell, Europe spiraled into centuries of feudal war and superstition. When the noble lie of divine kingship crumbled, revolutions brought both freedom and bloodshed. Today, as people question the noble lies of endless growth and unstoppable progress, we are seeing the rise of conspiracy movements, extremist politics, and apocalyptic thinking. It is not that people stop believing in stories. It is that they scramble to find new ones, no matter how destructive. This is why Plato's idea feels almost prophetic. He thought rulers needed to craft myths to hold society together. But what he may have accidentally predicted is that the collapse of those myths would one day unravel civilizations themselves. Our survival depends on believing in stories, and yet those very stories carry the seeds of our downfall. It is a paradox with no easy exit. Consider climate change as an example. For decades, the noble lie was that economic growth and environmental health could exist together without conflict. We were told that small adjustments, green technologies, and market solutions would keep the machine running forever. Many people believed it because they wanted to. But as evidence piles up, as floods and wildfires and extinctions mount, more and more people are realizing the story does not hold. And just like the run on a bank, once belief shifts, collapse accelerates. People either fall into despair or cling to extreme denial. Either way, the noble lie shatters and stability goes with it. The terrifying part is how quickly it can happen. Trust builds slowly, over centuries sometimes, but collapse is fast. The Soviet Union looked permanent until the day it dissolved almost overnight. Financial markets look stable until panic sends them spiraling in hours. Even personal trust in relationship or family can shatter in a single betrayal. The noble lie is like glass, beautiful, strong, transparent, but once it cracks, the break spreads instantly. And yet, here is the validation. If you feel uneasy about the stories you are told, if you feel that something does not quite add up, you are not alone. That discomfort is not a flaw. It is awareness. It means you are noticing the cracks before others do. And while that may feel terrifying, it also gives you the chance to prepare, to think critically, to search for truths that are harder but stronger than lies. Still, the question remains, if every civilization rests on some version of the noble lie, and if collapse is inevitable once the lie breaks down, then what happens when ours begins to fall apart? What will replace it? Will it be chaos, or will it be something new? Nietzsche and Nihilism's Endgame. Nietzsche once warned that when God is dead, it is not the liberation people expect. It is the beginning of an earthquake that keeps rumbling until everything built on faith, morality, and meaning begins to crack. He called it nihilism, the terrifying recognition that there might be no ultimate purpose to human life. And while it sounds abstract, Nietzsche may have accidentally mapped out the endgame for our species. Picture this. For thousands of years, humanity ran on a shared battery called belief. Belief in gods, in destiny, in nations, in progress. These beliefs were fuel. They gave people the courage to fight wars, to build monuments, to sacrifice for future generations. Nietzsche's fear was simple but devastating. If that fuel runs out, if humans lose their shared sense of why anything matters, then the machine grinds to a halt. A civilization without belief does not collapse with explosions. It collapses with apathy. Here is where the shock lands. Modern psychology has confirmed what Nietzsche sensed. Human beings cannot survive on survival alone. Studies on motivation show that when people cannot connect their daily actions to a higher purpose, whether that is family, religion, or legacy, they deteriorate. Depression rates rise. Birth rates fall. Societies hollow out from within. That is nihilism in action, not as a philosophical debate, but as a lived reality. And when entire nations lose the will to continue, extinction is not about an asteroid or a nuclear bomb. It is about choosing not to go on. Think about the strange paradox of our time. We live in the most technologically advanced era in history. We have medicine that can cure, machines that can build, networks that can connect billions of people instantly. And yet anxiety, loneliness, and despair are skyrocketing. It is not that we lack power. It is that we lack meaning. Nietzsche warned that once the old gods were gone, humanity would either create new values or collapse into despair. The haunting question is whether we have failed to create anything strong enough to replace them. But this is not just about religion. It is about the foundations of belief itself. The Enlightenment promised that reason and science would replace faith. But science cannot tell you why to wake up tomorrow. It can tell you how neurons fire, but not why suffering matters. It can map the stars, but not tell you why human life should continue. Without a story, without a shared sense of why, we are left with endless information and no direction. And when a species has no direction, it drifts until it disappears. Here is where validation comes in. If you have ever felt the creeping thought that none of this really matters, that the jobs, the debts, the politics are all just distractions, you are not broken. You are experiencing exactly what Nietzsche described. He saw it not as a personal failing, but as a cultural destiny. He called it the shadow of nihilism, a darkness cast by the collapse of old beliefs that still lingers even when we try to move on. The fact that you feel it means you are awake to the reality most people try to bury. And yet, Nietzsche was not only a prophet of despair. He also believed there was one way out, though it was brutal. He said we must become creators of meaning. We must act as if life has value, even if no higher power guarantees it. This is where his idea of the Übermensch comes in, not as a comic book hero, but as a human who dares to invent purpose instead of waiting for one to be handed down. But here is the terrifying twist. If most of humanity cannot do that, if we cannot collectively invent values strong enough to bind us together, then nihilism is not a stage to pass through. It is the endgame. Look at birth rates falling in developed nations. Look at the rise in deaths of despair, suicides, overdoses, and people quietly opting out of the future. This is nihilism at scale. Civilizations do not always fall with fire. Sometimes they just fade, as fewer people choose to carry life forward. Nietzsche might say extinction will not come from an external blow. It will come from within, from a slow erosion of willpower, until humanity simply stops choosing to continue. And that leads to the final tease. Nietzsche posed a question called the eternal recurrence. He asked, what if you had to live this exact life over and over for eternity? Would you curse it, or would you embrace it? That question was his way of forcing us to confront meaning directly, to ask ourselves whether we can affirm life even in the face of nothingness. Because if we cannot, then nihilism has already won. And if nihilism wins, human extinction is not a matter of catastrophe. It is a matter of inevitability. Hobbes' state of nature. Hobbes did not sugarcoat human nature. He looked at people stripped of laws, stripped of governments, stripped of the masks we wear in polite society, and what he saw was not peace or harmony but fear. In his words, life in the state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Brutal honesty like that forces you to wonder. Was Hobbes only describing the past, or was he unknowingly predicting the end of our future? The chilling part is how recognizable his vision still feels. Imagine society as a fragile shell, a thin layer of rules and contracts that keep us cooperating. Now imagine that shell cracking. Power grids fail, food systems collapse, governments lose control. Strip away those fragile protections, and what happens? According to Hobbes, people do not rise together. They fall into a war of all against all, and history keeps proving him right. Think about the moments when order vanishes. Natural disasters, blackouts, revolutions. The veneer of civilization disappears almost instantly. People loot stores, mobs form, neighbors stop trusting each other. During Hurricane Katrina, survivors reported not only flooding but armed groups roaming the streets. In the blackout of New York in the 1970s, looting erupted within hours. Hobbes' state of nature is not some distant primitive world. It reappears every time systems fail. And if collapse ever happens globally, the state of nature is not just a theory. It becomes the endgame. What makes this terrifying is how psychology backs it up. Humans are wired for self-preservation first. Neuroscientists call it the survival brain. Under stress, blood flow moves away from higher reasoning into fight or flight responses. Compassion, morality, and long-term thinking shut down. What rises is instinct. Hunger, fear, aggression. The civilized mask slips, and Hobbes' state of nature emerges from within us. It does not take centuries to appear, it takes minutes. Now here is where the validation comes in. If you have ever wondered why society feels so fragile, why a single shock could send us spiraling, you are not paranoid. Hobbes saw it centuries ago. He believed the only reason we are not already tearing each other apart is because we have a Leviathan, a powerful authority that enforces peace by fear. Governments, police, militaries, laws. Remove that Leviathan, and the natural condition of humanity reasserts itself. And what he called the natural condition looks hauntingly like extinction. Think about it logically. If global infrastructure collapsed, whether through nuclear war, climate catastrophe, or a pandemic beyond control, humanity would not simply cooperate to rebuild. Competition for resources would take over. Water, food, shelter, medicine. Each group fighting for survival. Nations would fragment into tribes, and with modern weapons in the hands of desperate people, the war of all against all would not just be brutal, it would be final. But here is the twist. Hobbes did not write this vision as a prophecy of doom. He wrote it as a warning. He wanted people to recognize their own fragility so they would choose order, even if it meant submitting to authority. He argued that fear of chaos was the glue that holds societies together, and maybe that is the uncomfortable truth we ignore. That the real reason we obey laws, the real reason we pay taxes or follow rules, is not because we are moral saints, but because deep down we know what happens when order collapses. We know Hobbes is right. The evidence is everywhere once you look. Why do people hoard toilet paper at the first sign of crisis? Why do markets crash the moment confidence wavers? It is not just panic. It is the state of nature bubbling under the surface. A reminder that trust is paper thin and can burn away instantly. And when trust is gone, collapse spreads faster than any virus. Now imagine scaling that to a global level. Picture 8 billion people all reverting to survival brain at the same time. Borders closing, governments splintering, neighbors turning on neighbors. Civilization depends on cooperation, but the state of nature depends on domination. Hobbes believed the stronger always win, and the weaker are consumed. If he is right, then our extinction does not need an asteroid. It just needs us to lose the Leviathan for long enough. Here is where the emotional knife twists. We like to believe we are different now, that we are too advanced, too connected, too moral to collapse into Hobbes' nightmare. But every disaster proves otherwise. Strip away comfort, and people fight for resources. Strip away order, and violence erupts. Strip away hope, and the will to cooperate disappears. Hobbes' vision lingers like a shadow waiting for the light to fail. And yet, here is the most unsettling part. Hobbes believed the state of nature is not just behind us. It is always with us, lurking beneath every civilization. That means collapse is not a one-time event. It is a cycle. Order rises, then breaks, then returns to the natural condition. If he is right, extinction is simply the moment when we cannot rebuild fast enough to escape it again. So the question is not whether Hobbes' state of nature exists. The question is how long the Leviathan can hold it back. And if that Leviathan ever falls, will humanity claw its way back to order one more time, or will this time be the last? Heidegger on tech overload. Heidegger warned about technology long before smartphones, artificial intelligence, or social media even existed. He said technology is not just a collection of tools we use. It is a way of framing the entire world. In his words, it turns everything, including nature, resources, even human beings, into standing reserve. That means into objects waiting to be used, optimized, consumed. And once you see reality that way, the question of survival shifts. Because if everything is a resource, eventually so are we. Here is where it gets disturbing. Think about how you already experience life through a technological lens. You are not a person online. You are data. Your worth is measured in clicks, in time on screen, in what products you might buy. Forests are not forests. They are carbon credits or lumber supply. Oceans are not oceans. They are shipping routes or energy reserves. Heidegger feared that when technology dominates thought, nothing is sacred anymore. Everything becomes material for consumption. That mindset, if taken to its logical conclusion, does not just exploit the planet, it exhausts it. And when the planet is exhausted, extinction is not an accident. It is a certainty. The shocking part is how invisible it feels while it happens. Technology promises convenience, connection, progress. But that promise hides the cost. Psychologists call it the hedonic treadmill. Every new tool excites us for a moment, then becomes normal, leaving us restless for the next upgrade. More speed, more power, more consumption. Heidegger saw this cycle not as advancement, but as a trap. Because if we never step off the treadmill, we run faster and faster until we burn out the ground beneath us. You already feel it in your own life. The endless notifications, the pressure to be available, the subtle anxiety when you are disconnected. That is not you failing to adapt. That is the overload Heidegger predicted. The human mind was not built to process infinite streams of information every waking moment. Studies now show constant digital exposure rewires attention spans, increases stress hormones, and makes deep focus nearly impossible. If technology is meant to serve us, why does it feel like we are serving it? Why does it feel like it is colonizing the very structure of our brains? Here is the validation. If you feel drained by screens, if you feel suffocated by the pace of modern life, you are not weak. You are sensing exactly what Heidegger described. He said the danger of technology is not that it destroys us in a single blow, but that it reshapes us without us noticing. We stop asking if a thing should be done and only ask if it can be done. We stop asking what life is for and only ask how to make it faster, more efficient, more optimized. And in the process, we lose sight of what it even means to be human. Now imagine scaling that blindness to the level of civilization. If everything is standing reserve, then every decision is about extraction, growth, acceleration. Forests cleared, oceans drained, species erased, all in the name of feeding the machine. Heidegger feared this momentum would reach a point where humanity itself becomes disposable, just another resource. And in the age of automation and artificial intelligence, that fear suddenly feels less like philosophy and more like prophecy. Think about it. If machines can do our work, make our art, even simulate our relationships, what role is left for human beings? The overload does not just consume the environment, it consumes our identity. We risk becoming irrelevant in the very system we built. That is the endgame Heidegger warned about. Not nuclear war or climate catastrophe, but a slow erasure of human essence under the weight of technology's logic. The irony is that Heidegger did not hate technology itself. He knew tools could be useful. His fear was about forgetting that we are more than users, more than consumers, more than standing reserve. He argued that when we treat the world purely as resource, we forget the deeper mystery of existence. We lose reverence, we lose awe, and without awe, there is no reason to protect, no reason to preserve, no reason to continue. Extinction becomes not just possible, but rational. Why save what you no longer see as sacred? And yet, Heidegger also left a warning wrapped in a possibility. He believed the danger of technology might force us to wake up, to remember that being is more than efficiency. But here is the unsettling twist. There is no guarantee we will wake up in time. Overload may hit a tipping point, where the systems we built no longer serve us, but we are too dependent to escape. Imagine trying to shut off the internet for 1 week globally. Commerce collapses, hospitals fail, transportation halts. Humanity has become so entangled with technology that even unplugging could be deadly. That is the trap. That is the overload. The very thing meant to empower us becomes the thing we cannot survive without. So ask yourself this. If Heidegger is right, and technology has framed the world into nothing but standing reserve, then how far can this framing go before it collapses the system entirely? If humans themselves become just another resource, then what reason does the system have to keep us around? Marx and Capitalism's self-destruction. Karl Marx once said that capitalism carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. He believed it was not just an economic system, but a time bomb. What makes his warning so haunting is how familiar it feels right now, more than a century later. When you look at the cracks in modern life, the inequality, the burnout, the sense that the system is eating itself, you can't help but wonder if Marx did not just describe economics, but extinction. Think about the way capitalism operates. It thrives on growth, endless growth. Every year, more production, more consumption, more profit. It sounds fine in theory, but here's the catch. Infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible. Eventually, resources run out. The soil erodes, the oceans empty, the climate destabilizes. And yet the system cannot stop. It is like a shark that has to keep swimming or it dies. Except in this case, if the shark keeps swimming, it drags all of us down with it. The shock is that Marx predicted this dynamic long before climate change or mass extinction were on anyone's radar. He noticed that capitalism was not just unfair but unstable. It creates booms and busts, bubbles and crashes. It concentrates wealth into fewer and fewer hands, while the majority struggles harder to survive. Over time, he argued, this inequality becomes unbearable. The workers lose faith, the system cannibalizes itself, and collapse follows. What he may not have realized is how that collapse could scale globally. If the engine of capitalism accelerates past the point of no return, it is not just societies that fail. It could be humanity itself. You can already feel it. Look at the rising anxiety over jobs replaced by automation. Look at housing costs swallowing entire generations. Look at billionaires racing into space while millions cannot afford health care. This is not just inequality. This is the system hollowing itself out. Studies in psychology show that when people perceive a system as rigged beyond repair, they disengage. They stop investing in the future. They stop trusting institutions. They stop believing there is a reason to keep playing the game. That withdrawal is not only social unrest. It is a slow motion suicide of a civilization. Here is the validation. If you feel exhausted by the grind, if you feel like no matter how hard you work the system still bleeds you dry, you are not imagining it. Marx saw it too. He wrote that under capitalism, workers become alienated from their labor, from each other, even from themselves. You wake up, work all day to survive, but the fruits of your labor belong to someone else. Over time, life itself starts to feel hollow, like you are running on a treadmill that only speeds up. That feeling is not a personal failure. It is the design of the system. But here's the terrifying twist. Alienation does not just break individuals. It weakens entire societies. A culture of burned out, disconnected people is less able to cooperate, less willing to sacrifice for future generations. Birth rates decline. Civic trust collapses. When people feel like life is just endless exploitation, they stop choosing life. And when enough people make that choice, extinction is not dramatic, it is quiet. It is the system grinding down human will until there is nothing left to continue. And yet capitalism is clever. Every time it seems to collapse, it reinvents itself. After every crisis, it rebrands, adapts, and comes back stronger. But this resilience may also be the trap, because each reinvention requires more extraction, more expansion, more pressure on people and the planet. It is like patching a sinking ship by drilling new holes. The temporary fix only makes the final collapse faster when it comes. Marx argued that this cycle could not last forever. Either people overthrow it, or it devours itself. But what he may have underestimated is how globalized the system would become. In his time, collapse meant revolutions in a country or a region. Today, collapse means supply chains failing worldwide, economies linked so tightly that when one domino falls, the rest follow. There is no safe corner, no untouched refuge. Capitalism's self-destruction is now wired into a planetary scale. The most chilling part is how normalized it feels. Endless hustle culture, billion-dollar companies treating workers as disposable. The idea that worth equals productivity. People defending a system that is quietly killing them because they cannot imagine anything else. Marx would call this ideology, the false belief that the system is natural, eternal, unquestionable. But like every false belief, it eventually breaks. And when it breaks, the disillusionment is not gradual, it is explosive. So here is the question that Marx forces us to confront. What happens when the system collapses, not in one country, not in one sector, but everywhere at once? Do people band together to build something new, or does the sheer weight of exhaustion and alienation drag us past the point of recovery? He saw capitalism as a historical stage. But what if it is the final stage? What if its self-destruction does not clear the way for something better, but instead takes the whole species with it? Eternal recurrence of collapse. Imagine this for a moment. What if history is not a straight line of progress, but a wheel that keeps turning, crushing civilizations under the same weight again and again? Nietzsche asked us to picture the eternal recurrence, the idea that life might repeat endlessly in the exact same form. For him, it was a thought experiment about meaning. But if you apply it to civilizations, it becomes something much darker. What if collapse is not an exception in history, but the rule, destined to happen again and again until one day there are no humans left to repeat it? Look at the record. Mesopotamia gone. The Mayans gone. The Roman Empire gone. Every one of them believed they were permanent. Every one of them believed their order, their gods, their systems would last forever. And every single one of them fell. What if our civilization is no different? What if the eternal recurrence is not a cosmic riddle, but a brutal law of history? That no matter how advanced we become, collapse always finds us. That extinction is just the last collapse, the one we cannot recover from. Here's where the shock lands. Collapse does not need asteroids or alien invasions. It is baked into the way human systems evolve. Sociologists talk about complexity collapse. The idea that as societies grow more advanced, they require more energy, more resources, more bureaucracy to keep running. Eventually the weight becomes unbearable. One disruption, a drought, a war, a financial crash, and the whole tower topples. Then humans rebuild. Then the process starts again. Collapse is not a fluke. It is the cycle. And cycles do not end until the participants do. You can see the pattern repeating even now. Booms followed by recessions. Trust followed by corruption. Order followed by chaos. Technology meant to solve problems creating bigger ones. History is not progress. History is a loop. And if Nietzsche is right, that loop may not be moving us forward at all. It may just be spinning us in circles until the wheel grinds us down to dust. But here's the validation. If you have ever looked at the news and thought, Didn't we fight these battles already? Didn't we already learn this lesson? You are not crazy. You are watching recurrence play out in real time. Wars for territory. Inequality tearing societies apart. Climate cycles disrupting civilizations, just like they did thousands of years ago. Nietzsche wanted us to confront eternal recurrence on a personal level, to ask if we could embrace a life that repeats forever. But civilizations face the same challenge. Can we embrace a cycle we have never once escaped? The danger is that recurrence wears down resilience. Every collapse burns resources, kills knowledge, and traumatizes cultures. When Rome fell, much of human knowledge was lost for centuries. When civilizations collapse today, in a world as interconnected as ours, the losses could be global. And if collapse is eternal recurrence, then extinction is simply the final recurrence, the one we do not recover from, the one where too much knowledge, too many resources, too many lives are lost to rebuild again. The terrifying twist is how seductive progress feels in between collapses. During the rise, everything looks unstoppable. Cities grow taller, networks spread wider, technology feels limitless. Just like Rome thought it was eternal. Just like every empire thought it was eternal. Progress blinds us to the cycle until the cycle breaks us. That blindness may be the most dangerous part of all. Because if you cannot see the wheel turning, you cannot prepare for when it crushes you. And yet, Nietzsche's eternal recurrence was not only a warning, it was also a challenge. He asked if we could affirm life even if it repeats forever. If we could say yes to the cycle instead of despairing over it. Applied to collapse, this becomes a haunting question. Could humanity survive longer if we accepted that collapse is inevitable and prepared for it instead of pretending it will never happen? Or is denial part of the cycle too? Our refusal to see the recurrence until it is too late? Think about climate change. It is not the first time human activity destabilized the environment. Ancient Mesopotamian farmers destroyed their own soil through over-irrigation. The Mayans faced droughts partly caused by deforestation. Every time, humans pushed ecosystems too far. Every time, collapse followed. Today, we are repeating the cycle on a planetary scale. More growth, more extraction, more denial. If history recurs, then we already know the ending. Collapse is not just likely. Collapse is guaranteed. So here is the haunting thought. Eternal recurrence of collapse does not just mean we are doomed to repeat mistakes. It means the mistakes are the system itself. Collapse is not outside history. Collapse is history. And extinction may simply be the moment when the cycle, for the first time, has no one left to start it over. Pascal's wager on extinction. Blaise Pascal made a wager centuries ago that was meant to convince skeptics to believe in God. His argument was simple. If God exists and you believe, you gain everything. If God does not exist, you lose nothing. But if you refuse to believe and you are wrong, you lose everything. In other words, the risk of disbelief is too high. Now imagine applying that same logic to human survival. What if the real wager is not about God, but about extinction? Think about it. Every major risk to humanity, climate change, nuclear war, artificial intelligence, pandemics, comes with uncertainty. Some scientists warn they could wipe us out. Others say the odds are small, maybe negligible. But Pascal would argue the odds don't even matter. If the outcome of being wrong is extinction, then the only rational choice is to act as if the danger is real, because the cost of being careless is infinite. You do not just lose money or comfort. You lose the entire future of humanity. Here is where the shock hits. We are not playing this wager the way Pascal said we should. Instead of preparing for extinction risks, we underprepare. Governments debate, corporations stall, individuals distract themselves. Why? Because uncertainty feels like safety. People tell themselves, Maybe the worst will not happen. Maybe someone will invent a solution. Maybe the problem will fix itself. That is the gambler's fallacy disguised as optimism. But Pascal would say it is the exact opposite of rational. Betting against extinction risks is the dumbest bet you can make, because the downside is everything. Look at climate change. For decades, the debate has been about degrees of certainty. Some argue the models exaggerate, others argue they underestimate. But the rational wager is not to quibble about percentages. The rational wager is to act as if the risk is total collapse, because if the worst case is even remotely possible, the cost of being wrong is unthinkable. And yet humanity keeps wagering the other way. We gamble with the atmosphere, gamble with ecosystems, gamble with the stability of the planet itself, as if extinction is just another policy debate. Here's the validation. If you have ever felt crazy for worrying about the big picture while everyone else shrugs, you are not crazy. You are simply applying Pascal's logic to the stakes of survival. Psychologists call it availability bias, the tendency to downplay threats we cannot see immediately. Extinction feels abstract, so people focus on gas prices, elections, or weekend plans. But just because something feels distant does not make it safe. The wager does not care about feelings. The wager only cares about outcomes. And in the wager of extinction, ignoring the risk is the most dangerous choice of all. Now here's the cruel irony. Pascal's wager was about belief, but extinction's wager is about action. Belief alone does nothing. You can believe climate change is real and still drive the same car, eat the same way, vote the same way. What matters is whether belief translates into choices. And that is where humanity struggles. Because taking extinction seriously means sacrifice. It means giving up convenience, comfort, power. And humans are terrible at sacrifice for abstract futures. We want to believe we are rational, but our psychology is built for short-term wins, not long-term wagers. Consider nuclear weapons. The rational wager is clear. If nuclear war is even possible, then the only logical path is disarmament. Yet the world stockpiles thousands of warheads, each capable of ending civilization. Leaders gamble that deterrence will hold forever. But forever is a long time, and the downside of being wrong is everything. Pascal would call this not bravery but madness. It is choosing infinite loss for the comfort of short-term dominance. And here is the deeper terror. What if extinction is the one wager humanity refuses to take seriously until it is too late? What if we are wired to keep betting against the worst case scenario because we cannot emotionally handle its weight? That would mean Pascal's logic is correct, but our psychology makes us incapable of following it. We keep pretending the odds are in our favor until one day they are not, and by then, the wager is already lost. Yet Pascal also believed there was hope in the wager. He argued that choosing belief, even if uncertain, could reshape your life for the better. Apply that to extinction, and the message flips. Choosing to act as if survival is at stake does not just prevent disaster. It creates a healthier, safer, more meaningful world even if the worst case never arrives. If we prepare for collapse and it does not come, we still gain cleaner air, stable societies, and renewed trust in each other. The wager pays off either way. But if we bet the other direction, we lose everything. So the question is brutally simple. Which way will humanity place its chips? On convenience, denial, and short-term comfort? Or on survival, sacrifice, and the possibility of a future? Pascal's wager forces us to see that indecision is not neutral. Every day we fail to prepare, every delay, every dismissal, is already a bet against our survival. And in this game, there are no second chances. Fermi's paradox of self-destruction. Enrico Fermi once asked a question that still haunts us. If the universe is filled with billions of stars, and so many of them have planets, And so many of those planets must have life. Then where is everybody? This became known as the Fermi paradox. Statistically, we should see signs of alien civilizations everywhere. And yet, silence. No signals, no visitors, no galactic neighbors. One explanation is terrifying. Maybe intelligent life always destroys itself before it gets far enough to be noticed. If that is true, then the silence of the stars is not comforting. It is a warning. Think about it. To get from microbes to cities to space travel, life has to survive billions of years of accidents, asteroids, ice ages, volcanic eruptions. But the moment intelligence evolves, something new appears. Self-destruction. A creature that can split atoms, build weapons, drain ecosystems, alter climates, create machines it can no longer control. If every civilization eventually invents its own extinction button, then maybe the great filter is not out there. Maybe it is built into the very nature of intelligence itself. Here is where the shock lands. The silence we hear in space may be the sound of civilizations snuffing themselves out. Species that burned through their resources, poisoned their worlds, fought wars they could not survive. And maybe we are not the exception. Maybe we are just next in line. Every time you look up at the night sky, the emptiness could be a graveyard of failed civilizations, each one making the same mistake, thinking they had more time than they did. Psychologists call this optimism bias, the belief that disasters happen to others, not to us. People smoke, even though they know it causes cancer. Drivers text, even though they know it kills. Civilizations do the same. We keep burning fossil fuels, building weapons, pushing ecosystems to the brink, all while telling ourselves that somehow humanity will beat the odds. But if the Fermi paradox is right, no one ever beats the odds. Intelligence always backfires. Here is the validation. If you have ever felt that the silence of the universe is eerie, that may be the reason we see no one out there is, because we are all alone on a cliff edge. You are not alone in that fear. Scientists have wrestled with this for decades. The paradox is not just about aliens. It is about us. Every year that goes by without a signal is another year the theory of self-destruction looks more convincing. The universe is not empty. It is just full of civilizations that never lasted long enough to shout across the void. The cruel irony is that the very things that make us powerful are the things that make us fragile. Technology gave us medicine, but it also gave us bioweapons. Industry gave us abundance, but it also destabilized the climate. Nuclear physics gave us energy, but it also gave us bombs that can erase cities in seconds. Artificial intelligence may give us efficiency, but it may also replace us entirely. Progress and extinction are twins born from the same spark. The further intelligence climbs, the steeper the fall if it missteps. And here's the brutal twist. Even if just 1% of civilizations destroy themselves, the galaxy should still be buzzing with survivors. The fact that it is not suggests the percentage might be much closer to 100, which means humanity may already be inside the trap, playing out the same script as countless others before us. Build, expand, dominate, collapse. Over and over, until nothing is left but silence. But here's where the paradox stings even deeper. What if some civilizations survived, but the reason they are silent is because they learned the cost of speaking? Maybe broadcasting your existence to the cosmos is the quickest way to be wiped out by someone stronger. Maybe survival means hiding. If that is true, then humanity's eagerness to announce ourselves, beaming signals, sending probes, shouting into the void, might already be the beginning of our downfall. What if survival requires silence, and we are too loud to last? Now ask yourself this. If the silence of the stars is a mirror, what is it showing us? Maybe it is showing us that intelligence without wisdom always ends the same way. That civilizations destroy themselves before they ever learn how to live with their own power, that the universe is littered with ruins we will never see, and maybe, just maybe, our fate is already sealed in the same cycle. The paradox is not just a question, it is a prophecy. The wager is simple. Either we prove the Fermi paradox wrong by surviving longer than any civilization before us, or we become just another silent world in the cosmic graveyard. Every decision we make about energy, weapons, technology, environment is a move in that game. The stars will not save us. The silence means no one is coming. It is just us on this fragile planet staring into the abyss, trying to decide whether we will be the first to break the cycle or the next to vanish. Tower of Babel is tech warning. The ancient story of the Tower of Babel seems simple on the surface. Humans tried to build a tower high enough to reach the heavens. God saw their ambition, struck them with confusion, divided their languages, and scattered them across the earth. For centuries it was told as a tale of pride and punishment. But look at it again through the lens of technology, and it feels less like a myth and more like a warning about what happens when human ambition outgrows human wisdom. The unsettling part is how familiar it feels today. The people of Babel were not villains. They were innovators. They wanted progress, unity, a project so grand it touched the sky. In other words, they were doing exactly what we do now, building bigger systems, more powerful machines, trying to connect the entire planet through technology. And yet the story ends not with triumph, but with collapse. Humanity fractured, communication broken, dreams undone. What if the real lesson of Babel is not about divine punishment at all, but about how our own creations eventually overwhelm us? Think about it. Every major leap in technology feels like building bricks toward a modern Babel. The internet was supposed to unite humanity in shared understanding. Instead, it has splintered us into echo chambers, each speaking a different digital language. Artificial intelligence is being built to solve problems beyond human ability, yet its very complexity risks leaving us unable to understand the tools we create. Nuclear weapons were born from scientific genius, yet they gave us the power to erase ourselves in seconds. Just like the tower, the higher we build, the more fragile we become. Here is where the shock comes in. The downfall of Babel was not a meteor, not a war, not a famine. It was communication breaking. The one thing holding their project together, shared language, fractured, and the whole structure collapsed. Today, our survival also depends on communication. Global coordination against climate change, international treaties against weapons, ethical agreements about artificial intelligence. And yet we are more divided than ever. Nations compete instead of cooperate. Algorithms polarize instead of unite. Just like Babel, the very systems meant to connect us may be the ones that destroy us. Psychologists call this coordination failure. When groups cannot align on a shared goal, they make choices that hurt everyone, even when cooperation would benefit all. It is the tragedy of the commons on a planetary scale. If Babel is a warning, it is this: the higher the stakes, the greater the danger of collapse when we cannot speak the same language, whether literally or politically, and extinction becomes not just possible, but likely, when division spreads faster than solutions. Here's the validation. If you feel like humanity's biggest problems are not technical but human, our inability to agree, to trust, to act together, you are right. We already have the knowledge to slow climate change, to reduce nuclear stockpiles, to regulate dangerous technologies. But knowledge is useless without cooperation. The tower falls not because the bricks are weak, but because the builders stop speaking to each other. And every time you see leaders bickering, nations blaming, or people talking past each other, you are watching the cracks in Babel's foundation open again. Now here is the cruel irony. The dream of Babel was unity. The very ambition to build something beyond human scale came from wanting to overcome division. But in reaching too high, they triggered the very fracture they feared. Technology today follows the same paradox. We invent tools to solve problems, but those tools create even bigger ones. We build networks to connect, but they divide. We build weapons to protect, but they threaten. We build machines to save time, but they consume our lives. The higher we build, the more we risk the fall. And the fall may not look like fire raining from the sky. It may look like silence. Systems too complex to understand breaking down piece by piece. Misinformation overwhelming truth until no one can agree on reality. Nations hoarding resources instead of sharing them. AI systems operating beyond human comprehension. Collapse in the age of Babel is not a single explosion. It is the quiet unraveling of meaning until no one can speak to each other, no one can coordinate, and no one can hold the tower together. But there is one last twist in the story. After Babel collapses, humanity scatters but survives. They build again, smaller this time, more humble, more cautious. Maybe that is why the story has lasted so long. It is not just about the danger of ambition. It is about the cycle of collapse and rebuilding. The terrifying question is whether we will be so lucky. Our tower is no longer bricks. It is nuclear stockpiles, AI code, global supply chains, satellites in orbit. If our Babel falls, the scattering may not leave survivors. So the real question is this: how high can we build before our ambition outpaces our ability to hold it together? And if the tower does fall, will there be anyone left to rebuild? Or will the story of Babel be the last story we ever get to tell? Camus and the absurd end? Albert Camus once said the only real philosophical question is whether life is worth living. He called it the problem of the absurd, the clash between our desperate hunger for meaning and the universe's cold silence. Most people hear that and think it's just an existential crisis, something personal. But zoom out. What happens when an entire civilization collides with that silence? What if the absurd does not just crush the individual, but swallows humanity itself? Here is where the chill creeps in. Camus argued that when humans face the absurd, they reach for answers. Religion, ideology, progress. Anything to pretend there is a script. But when the illusion cracks, despair sets in. Now picture this not at the level of one person, but at the scale of billions. Imagine a future where humanity realizes that no matter how far we travel, no matter what we build, the stars stay silent, death still wins, and nothing lasts. That recognition could be the end. Not by fire, not by war, but by resignation. A collective shrug in the face of the absurd. We tend to imagine extinction as dramatic. Asteroids, nukes, plagues. But Camus points to another path, quieter and stranger, the possibility that humanity gives up because meaning itself collapses. Progress stops not because we can't keep going, but because we stop wanting to. Why build? Why endure, if nothing matters? The absurd does not kill with violence. It kills with indifference. And the terrifying part is how close we already live to that mood. Look around. Rates of depression, anxiety, and meaning crises are exploding worldwide. People sense that the old stories, religion, nationalism, consumerism, don't hold like they used to. Technology promised connection, but it often amplifies emptiness. Politics promise direction, but it often delivers only chaos. In Camus terms, the absurd is leaking into the collective. Individuals can endure it by rebelling, choosing to live without meaning anyway. But can an entire species do the same? Or will we collapse into nihilism before an asteroid even has the chance? Here's the validation. If you've ever felt like the real threat is not bombs or melting ice, but apathy, that sense that people just stop caring, you're seeing the world through Camus' eyes. Psychologists call this learned helplessness. When beings face constant threats they cannot control, they stop trying, even when escape is possible. Dogs shocked in experiments lay down and quit, even when the door was open. Humans do it too. And a species facing extinction risks, climate, nukes AI, may eventually do the same, not because we can't act, but because we no longer believe action matters. Now here is the cruel irony. Camus thought the solution to the absurd was rebellion, not revolution in the political sense, but a personal stance. To stare at the void, acknowledge the silence, and still choose to live. To say yes to life without illusions. He saw Sisyphus pushing his rock forever not as tragedy, but as triumph, because he accepted his fate and lived it anyway. But Sisyphus is just one man. What happens when the entire species is Sisyphus? Can 8 billion people find joy in pushing the rock of survival, knowing the universe will never care? Or do we finally let go of the stone and let it roll back, crushing us under its weight? And here's where the dread sharpens. The absurd does not give us a timeline. Extinction from despair could creep slowly. Birth rates dropping not because of famine, but because no one wants children in a meaningless world. Nations paralyzed not by war, but by aimlessness. Civilizations fading like embers in a fire that never exploded, just slowly went cold. No bang, no blaze, just the soft suffocation of giving up. Humanity extinguished not by disaster, but by silence. Yet Camus left a challenge hanging. He insisted that the absurd was not a reason to die, but a reason to live more fully. To stop waiting for ultimate meaning and start creating small, stubborn ones. To laugh, to love, to work, even knowing it adds up to nothing cosmic. In that rebellion lies survival, which means the question of extinction may not hinge on asteroids or weapons, but on whether we can collectively adopt the attitude of Sisyphus. Whether we can rebel against the absurd together, pushing the stone of existence even when it feels pointless. So the paradox stands. Camus tells us life only matters if we insist it does. But if we fail to insist, if the absurd crushes our will before the bombs or the plagues arrive, then humanity's end will not be written in fire or blood, but in something stranger. The slow fade of a species that simply stopped playing. The last chapter of the absurd is not just about asking if life is worth living. It's asking whether humanity itself will keep answering yes. Stoics on desire and ruin. The Stoics had a simple idea that feels almost too obvious to matter. Desire leads to suffering. The more we crave, the more we cling, the more we chase, the more fragile we become. Epictetus said if you want to be free, want less. Marcus Aurelius warned that desire chains the mind. Seneca called wealth a burden disguised as blessing. They were not just talking about individuals. They were whispering something much darker. That entire civilizations can collapse under the weight of their own desires. Think about it. Desire built everything around us. Skyscrapers, smartphones, endless markets, endless upgrades. Desire fuels growth, innovation, competition. But what if the very thing that powers us is also the thing that ruins us? The Stoics saw it coming. They believed that desire, unchecked, grows faster than reason. And when the appetite of a society outpaces its wisdom, collapse is inevitable. Here is where the shock comes in. Human extinction may not come from some external asteroid or alien invasion. It might come from something as ordinary as our hunger. Desire for more energy drives climate change. Desire for dominance drives war. Desire for convenience drives the spread of technologies we cannot control. Desire is not just personal weakness. It is a systemic engine of ruin. Psychologists today would call it the hedonic treadmill. The more you get, the more you want, and the less satisfied you feel. Desire scales infinitely, but resources do not. At the individual level, it means no purchase ever makes you happy for long. At the civilizational level, it means no amount of growth is ever enough. We strip the planet for resources, we flood the skies with carbon, we devour forests and oceans, all because we believe the next upgrade, the next frontier, the next profit will finally be enough. It never is. And that gap between infinite craving and finite reality could be the very thing that erases us. Here's the validation. If you have ever looked around and felt like humanity is moving too fast, consuming too much, wanting without end, you are seeing what the Stoics warned about. They lived in empires that already showed the cracks of greed. Rome with its endless conquests, its obsession with luxury, its addiction to spectacle. The Stoics stood in the middle of that storm and said, "This will not last." And they were right. Rome burned not just from enemies outside, but from desires inside. Now here's the cruel irony. Desire is the one thing we are taught to celebrate. Entire economies depend on it. Advertisers, corporations, governments all rely on keeping desire alive. More consumption, more demand, more growth. If people suddenly lived like Stoics, wanting less, being content with enough, the entire system would wobble, which means our survival may literally require the one thing our system cannot allow: restraint. The Stoics called it temperance. We call it unsustainable. And here's where the dread sharpens. The Stoics were not naive. They knew desire cannot be eliminated. You cannot erase hunger, or ambition, or curiosity, but you can master it. You can set limits. You can learn to stop before your craving eats you alive. What terrifies me is that individuals can do this, but can entire civilizations? Can 8 billion people collectively decide to want less, or is that against human nature? If so, then the cycle is locked. Desire builds civilizations. Desire grows them beyond their means. Desire ruins them. Over and over again until the last collapse is final. Imagine extinction not as sudden catastrophe, but as the final chapter of overindulgence. Cities drowning not in war, but in rising seas we created through our hunger for energy. Forests gone not from enemies, but from our appetite for consumption. Species vanishing not from chance, but from our desire to dominate. Humanity undone not by something outside us, but by the very thing inside us that once drove us forward. The Stoics would have seen it coming. They would have said that desire is a fire that must be managed, not worshipped. Too little, and life stagnates. Too much, and everything burns. Right now, the fire is raging, and instead of water, we pour gasoline. So here's the question. Can humanity rediscover the art of restraint before desire consumes us entirely? Can we step off the treadmill, slow the hunger, accept enough? Or will we, like every empire before us, chase more until there is nothing left to chase? The Stoics would not be surprised either way. They knew desire is both the spark of life and the seed of ruin. The only question is whether we can master it, or whether it will be the last thing we ever serve. Descartes' doubt of reality. René Descartes once sat alone and decided to doubt everything. His senses, his memories, the world around him. He asked himself a question most people are too afraid to even whisper. What if none of this is real? What if reality itself is an illusion, a trick played on us by some deeper force? For him it was a philosophical experiment, a way to strip life down to its foundations. For us, centuries later, it may be something much darker. Because if you follow Descartes' doubt far enough, you run into a possibility most people never see coming. Human extinction may not look like fire or famine. It may look like waking up from a dream that was never real to begin with. Here's the unsettling twist. Descartes built his entire philosophy on the one thing he could not doubt, his own act of thinking. But imagine that same thought experiment applied not to one man at a desk, but to an entire species standing at the edge of its own survival. What if the greatest threat to humanity is not bombs or disease, but reality itself unraveling. If the very fabric of what we call real starts to break down, then extinction might not even be something we notice. It would be like a dream fading as you wake. The end would not be violent, it would be disorienting. Now, this might sound abstract, but the shock comes when you realize how close we already are to living inside a doubt-driven collapse. Think about virtual reality, artificial intelligence, deepfakes, synthetic media. Every year, our ability to distinguish truth from fiction shrinks. Whole populations are being manipulated by illusions on screens, illusions so convincing they rewrite memory and identity. If reality is the anchor that keeps a civilization sane, then doubt is the crack that loosens the chain. And once reality itself becomes untrustworthy, collective collapse is not far behind. Psychologists call this epistemic instability. When a person no longer knows what is real, their decision-making shatters. Now stretch that across billions. If we cannot agree on what is happening, if one half of humanity believes the opposite of the other, then cooperation dies. And with cooperation gone, survival is impossible. Descartes' doubt becomes not a clever trick, but a contagion. It spreads until everyone is living inside their own simulation of reality, cut off, isolated, incapable of acting together. Here's the validation. If you've ever felt like we are drowning in misinformation, like truth itself is slipping through our fingers, you're not crazy. It's exactly the nightmare Descartes warned could happen if we trusted our senses too much. He at least believed he could anchor himself in thought. But for us, what happens when thinking itself is hacked? When algorithms feed us illusions until even our reasoning is guided by lies? The doubt Descartes used to find certainty may end up being the doubt that tears us apart. Now here's the cruel irony. Descartes introduced radical doubt as a way to find stability. He stripped away everything until he could say, "I think, therefore I am." But imagine humanity trying to do the same. Strip away stories, strip away traditions, strip away every assumption until only raw thought is left. What would we find? Would we land on something solid, a universal anchor strong enough to unify 8 billion people? Or would we land on nothing, just an abyss, and finally stop pretending there was anything holding us up at all? And here's where the dread really sharpens. Extinction through doubt is not explosive, it's dissolving. It's not bombs falling, it's meaning evaporating. Imagine a future where no one trusts news, no one trusts leaders, no one trusts even their own memory. Every image could be fake, every fact disputed, every perception unreliable. In that world, how do you respond to crisis? A climate emergency, an AI misfire, a viral outbreak? If no one trusts what is real, then no one acts. Collapse comes not because the threats were unstoppable, but because doubt paralyzed us before we even tried. The Stoics warned desire could ruin us. Nietzsche warned nihilism could undo us. Camus warned the absurd might swallow us. Descartes adds another terrifying layer. What if we do not die from external ruin, but from the collapse of reality itself? What if extinction is not a bang or a whimper, but the silent moment where we realize none of it was real and there is nothing left to hold on to? So here is the final question Descartes never asked. If humanity one day doubts itself out of existence, would that even count as extinction? Or would it be something stranger? The vanishing of a dream that thought it was real, until the last moment when it wasn't. Buddhist Impermanence. The Buddhists had a teaching so simple most people dismiss it as obvious. Everything changes. Nothing lasts. Impermanence. But hidden inside that quiet phrase is maybe the most unsettling prediction of all. If nothing lasts, not feelings, not kingdoms, not mountains, not even stars, then why would humanity be any different? The doctrine of impermanence is not just about death, it is about extinction. The shock comes when you really sit with it. We like to imagine ourselves as an exception. Civilizations think they are permanent. Nations act like their power will stretch into forever. Technology tricks us into believing we can outpace decay. But impermanence has no mercy. Just as waves erase castles of sand, time erases species. The Buddhists never sugarcoated it. They taught that clinging to permanence is the root of suffering. And yet our entire world order is built on that illusion. That progress will last. That humanity will last. Now imagine impermanence not just as an idea, but as the law of reality grinding forward. Civilizations rise, they fall. Empires dominate, they dissolve. Species flourish, they vanish. 99% of all life forms that ever existed are already gone. If impermanence is the rule, then our survival is not guaranteed. It is the exception. Extinction is not a possibility. It is the default. Here's the validation. You already feel this in your own life. You see parents age, children grow, friends drift, jobs vanish, cities transform. You watch videos online from only 10 years ago, and the world looks alien already. That ache in your chest when something good ends is impermanence speaking. The Buddhists just widened the lens. If your relationships, your body, your memories are temporary, then so too is the species that carries them. We are not carved into eternity. We are written in sand. The cruel irony is that impermanence is not always tragic. It gives rise to beauty. Cherry blossoms in Japan are revered precisely because they fall so quickly. A song hits harder because it ends. A life means more because it is fleeting. But scale that truth to humanity and you feel the dread. The beauty of our existence comes from its fragility. But fragility at the species level means one day, inevitably, we vanish. Impermanence does not ask if. It only asks when. And here's where the Buddhists were sharper than many modern thinkers. They did not try to fight impermanence with denial. They said the real danger comes from attachment. When you cling to what must pass, you suffer. Applied to humanity, that might mean the collapse is not the tragedy. The tragedy is that we never learn to let go. We keep pretending we can outlast the rule that governs everything. And that self-deception may be what makes the end unbearable. Think about how humanity already resists impermanence. We build monuments to outlast time. We archive digital memories, hoping they will live forever in the cloud. We dream of uploading consciousness, colonizing planets, stretching into infinity. But the Buddhists would smile sadly at all that and say, "You are still clinging, and clinging is the path to ruin." Here's the dread sharpened even further. What if our frantic race to escape impermanence, our drive to dominate nature, to expand endlessly, to technologize everything, is not saving us, but dooming us? Because every time we push against impermanence, we consume more, destabilize more, and accelerate collapse. Maybe the Buddhists were pointing to a paradox. That survival depends not on outrunning impermanence, but on accepting it. And because we cannot accept it, we guarantee our own extinction. And yet, within that darkness is a strange kind of hope. Impermanence means that even extinction is not final in the grand sense. Just as stars die and new stars are born, just as species vanish and others emerge, the story continues in forms we cannot imagine. Humanity's end would not be the end of life or the end of reality. It would be one more turning in the wheel of impermanence. The Buddhists called it samsara, the endless cycle of birth and death. From that perspective, extinction is not apocalypse. It is transition. But that perspective requires letting go of what we most cling to. Our uniqueness, our permanence, our sense that humanity somehow transcends the laws of change. The doctrine of impermanence whispers otherwise. It tells us that just as morning becomes night, just as spring becomes fall, just as youth becomes age, humanity too will become something else, or nothing at all. So here is the question left hanging. If impermanence is the only constant, what do we do with our brief moment? Do we rage against it, wasting our last centuries in denial? Or do we learn what the Buddhists already knew, that only by accepting impermanence can we live fully, even as we vanish? Zeno's paradox of stagnation. Zeno of Ilia told stories that sounded like riddles meant to frustrate the mind. He imagined Achilles racing a tortoise. Achilles runs fast. The tortoise crawls slow. But because Achilles must first reach the place where the tortoise began, and then the place the tortoise moved after that, and then the place after that, step by step, he can never actually catch it. Infinite steps, infinite divisions, no finish line. At first it sounds absurd. Of course Achilles overtakes the tortoise. But Zeno was not just playing with logic. He was showing us something terrifying about progress itself. What if humanity is Achilles, running hard, chasing survival, but always cut into smaller and smaller steps, never reaching the end? What if extinction does not come from collapse, but from stagnation that stretches forever, a future that never arrives? Here is where the shock sets in. Most of us believe humanity is racing forward. Technology advances, medicine improves, knowledge expands. But what if all of this is illusion? What if every so-called breakthrough only creates another step, another division, another delay, until we are trapped in Zeno's paradox, always moving, never arriving? Imagine a species that pours centuries into curing disease, only to invent new ones. A species that builds weapons to end wars, only to create wars more catastrophic. A species that designs technology to save time, only to become enslaved by it. Forward motion that never truly moves us. A race that never ends. And here's the validation. You already feel this in your bones. We live in a world addicted to announcements of progress. A faster phone, a stronger engine, a smarter AI. But how much of it actually delivers us closer to security, to stability, to peace? Or do we just find ourselves in the same race, new tortoise, same chase? Ask yourself, are we really solving problems? Or are we just dividing them into infinite fragments, each more complicated than the last? Psychologists describe something called the progress paradox. The more advancements people experience, the less satisfied they feel. Life expectancy rises, but so do rates of anxiety. Communication gets easier, but so does isolation. More wealth, more depression. It is Zeno's paradox written into the psyche. Progress exists, but fulfillment always outruns us by one more step. Now stretch that onto a civilizational scale. If the finish line of security and survival is always one step further, then humanity may never arrive. And extinction comes not from falling behind, but from running forever without reaching safety. Here's the cruel irony. Zeno's paradox was solved mathematically centuries later. Infinite steps can still add up to a finite distance. Achilles does pass the tortoise. But the metaphor lingers because psychologically, socially, politically, we are still trapped. Climate change is a perfect example. Every international agreement is a step. Every technological fix is a step. Every promise is a step. And yet the finish line, the moment where we actually solve it, keeps sliding further. We are running, but the tortoise of collapse still crawls ahead of us. Think of it like this. Stagnation does not always mean standing still. It can mean running in circles. A treadmill feels like effort, but it delivers you nowhere. Zeno's paradox reminds us that speed without arrival is still paralysis. And if humanity spends all its energy sprinting without ever finishing, then extinction may come quietly, not through sudden catastrophe, but through endless stalling until resources run out, until systems break, until the tortoise crosses a line we never reached. And here's where the dread sharpens. What if this is the real fate of intelligent civilizations everywhere? Fermi's paradox asks why we see no aliens. Maybe it is because they all got caught in Zeno's paradox of stagnation. They advanced, but each advance created more division, more delay, more complexity, until forward motion became its own trap. Progress without destination, growth without arrival, a race without end. If that is the universal law, then our extinction is not unique. It is the natural result of chasing a finish line that forever retreats. But there is another way to see it. Zeno's paradox is a mirror. It forces us to confront the illusion that movement equals progress. Maybe the real question is not how fast we run, but where we aim. Maybe extinction is only inevitable if we keep mistaking motion for arrival. But are we capable of pausing long enough to ask what the race is even for? So here's the question left hanging. Is humanity sprinting toward survival? Or are we trapped in a paradox, running forever but arriving nowhere? Zeno might say the tortoise of ruin will always stay just out of reach. The only question is how long we can run before the race itself becomes the end. Mass Man and Collapse, Ortega. José Ortega y Gasset looked at the world in the early 20th century and saw something chilling. Not the rise of one tyrant or one system, but the rise of the masses themselves. He said the danger was not a single despot, but the ordinary person swollen with power, convinced that their desires defined reality. He called it the revolt of the masses, and his warning cuts sharper today than ever. Because when the mass man takes over, collapse is not just possible, it becomes inevitable. Here's where the shock comes in. The mass man is not a villain in the shadows. The mass man is us. Ortega described him as the one who takes everything for granted. The one who enjoys the benefits of civilization, roads, medicine, rights, technology, without ever asking what made them possible. He assumes these things will always be there. He believes progress is automatic, that comfort is permanent, that history is over. But history never ends. And civilizations built on that illusion eventually collapse under their own weight. Think about it. When too many people consume without contributing, when too many people believe rights exist without responsibilities, when too many assume the world will just keep running because it always has, systems rot. Ortega was not mocking ordinary life. He was warning that when the mass mentality dominates, no one protects the fragile foundations holding everything together. We all just keep taking, assuming someone else will hold the line, until there is no one left to do it. That is how civilizations die quietly, not from conquest, but from complacency. And here's the validation. You already see this happening around you. People demand cheap food, but ignore the fragile supply chains behind it. People expect energy at the flip of a switch, but resist the costs of generating it. People treat rights as unshakable, forgetting they were fought for, maintained, defended. And when systems strain, when the grid falters, when trust breaks down, when institutions wobble, the mass response is not sacrifice. It is outrage. Ortega saw it coming. The mass man, he said, does not say thank you. He only says, this is my right. And when everyone thinks like that, the structure collapses. Psychologists today call this entitlement creep. The more comfort people get, the more they assume it is natural. The less they imagine losing it. Entire populations grow up believing abundance is the baseline of existence. But history shows abundance is the exception. Collapse is the baseline. Ortega's mass man lives in denial of that truth, and denial is exactly what accelerates the fall. Here is the cruel irony. Democracies, which give the masses more power than ever before, are especially vulnerable. Ortega warned that the mass man feels his opinions are as valid as any experts, his instincts as trustworthy as any science. When masses treat expertise as arrogance, when they see knowledge as elitism, when they confuse desire with truth, society loses its compass. Collapse becomes not a failure of resources, but a failure of meaning. Nobody agrees what is true. Nobody agrees what is necessary. And the machinery of civilization seizes up. And you feel this, don't you? Every argument online that spirals into noise. Every public debate where facts dissolve into feelings. Every crisis where the crowd refuses to face sacrifice because it feels unfair. It is Ortega's nightmare playing out in real time. The mass man does not think he must rise to meet reality. He believes reality should bend to him. But reality never bends, it breaks. Now imagine what this looks like in the context of extinction. A species facing climate collapse, nuclear risk, technological upheaval. A species that needs coordination, discipline, foresight. And instead what emerges is the mass man. Outraged at every inconvenience, unwilling to imagine limits, demanding more comfort while the foundations burn. Collapse becomes not an accident, but the logical end of mass entitlement. The very survival instinct is numbed by comfort. Here's the paradox Ortega leaves us with. Civilization creates the conditions for masses to rise. Comfort multiplies, education spreads, rights expand. And that is good. Until the masses forget where it all came from. The very success of civilization births the mentality that destroys it. Mass man consumes the inheritance of history without understanding its cost. And by the time the bill comes due, there is no one left willing to pay it. So here is the final haunting question. If extinction comes, will it arrive not with enemies at the gate, but with billions of us sitting inside, comfortable, angry, demanding more, blind to the collapse already unfolding around us? Ortega would say yes. The end does not require a tyrant. It only requires a mass of people who believe the end cannot happen. Bacon on Science Without Morals. Francis Bacon, the so-called father of modern science, gave us the blueprint for knowledge as power. He imagined a future where observation, experimentation, and reason would unlock the secrets of nature and place them in human hands. That vision came true. The airplane, the antibiotic, the atom, all of it stands on his shoulders. But here is the warning hidden in his gift. Bacon separated science from morals. Knowledge, he said, should be pursued not for tradition, not for religion, not for virtue, but for power over nature. And that separation, that raw unchained pursuit, may be the very path to human extinction. The shock comes when you look at what that has meant in practice. Science gave us vaccines that eradicated smallpox, and bombs that could eradicate us. Science gave us the internet that connected billions, and surveillance systems that monitor billions. Science gave us industrial growth that fed the world, and climate collapse that now threatens it. Bacon was right, knowledge is power, but power without direction, without morality, becomes destruction. Humanity has mastered the how while forgetting the why, and that imbalance is deadly. Think about it. For most of history, knowledge was tied to some higher framework. Priests tied it to the divine. Philosophers tied it to virtue. Elders tied it to survival of the tribe. But Bacon untied the knot. He unleashed knowledge as an independent force, liberated from moral anchors. The result was breathtaking. Progress exploded, but so did the risk. Because once knowledge is free from morality, there is no built-in limit. You can split the atom without asking if you should. You can edit genes without asking where the line ends. You can build artificial intelligence without asking if it should have a leash. Knowledge no longer waits for wisdom. It just advances. And you feel this today, don't you? The headlines show breakthroughs faster than anyone can process. Scientists grow meat in labs, edit embryos, create machines that write and think. Each step feels thrilling, but each step also carries shadows, and those shadows rarely stop the march. Because the Baconian dream says knowledge must keep going. The frontier must always be pushed, whether or not humanity is ready for what it uncovers. Psychologists talk about moral disengagement. It is the mental trick that lets people say, I am just doing my job. I am just advancing the science. The consequences are someone else's problem. This is exactly the danger Bacon unleashed. When knowledge is detached from morality, responsibility scatters. Scientists focus on the experiment. Corporations focus on the profit. Governments focus on the advantage. But who carries the weight of asking, should this exist at all? If nobody asks, then extinction becomes not a freak accident, but the endpoint of unrestrained discovery. Here's the cruel irony. Bacon himself believed science should serve human flourishing. He dreamed of curing disease, feeding the hungry, improving life. But by removing morality as a boundary, he left no mechanism to stop science from serving the opposite. It is like giving a child fire and telling him to explore, trusting that somehow he will not burn down the house. The fire lights the dark, but it also burns everything it touches. And you already see this paradox in motion. The Industrial Revolution gave us wealth and convenience, and it also set the stage for environmental collapse. Digital technology gave us infinite information, and it also unleashed disinformation and addiction at global scale. Nuclear research promised endless energy, and it also placed a doomsday clock over our heads. Every breakthrough seems to contain its own undoing. This is the Baconian bargain. Knowledge without morals advances endlessly, but the end it advances toward may be our own. Now here's the dread that makes this even worse. Once a discovery is made, it cannot be unmade. Once the atom is split, once AI is trained, once CRISPR edits DNA, the genie is out of the bottle. Even if some people act with restraint, others will not. Even if one country bans a weapon, another will build it. Knowledge without morals does not just advance. It spreads uncontrollably until someone somewhere weaponizes it. Extinction becomes not just possible, but eventually inevitable. But there is another way to read Bacon's lesson. Maybe he was not blind. Maybe he was showing us that morality cannot be bolted onto science from the outside. It has to be integrated from the beginning. That knowledge without morality is like a body without a soul, capable of moving, but incapable of meaning. The question is whether humanity is capable of reintegrating what Bacon split apart. Whether we can demand that every discovery carry with it a reckoning of its consequences. And here is where the story leaves us uneasy. Because history suggests we rarely pause to ask those questions until it is too late. The bombs were built before the moral debates. The oil was burned before the climate warnings. The machines were unleashed before anyone asked if we should. Bacon may have opened the door to science without morals, but it is humanity that keeps walking through it. The extinction question is simple. How many more doors can we walk through before one of them shuts behind us forever? Kierkegaard's fatal despair. Ren Kierkegaard wrote about despair not as a passing sadness, but as the deepest sickness of the soul. For him, despair was not crying into your pillow or having a bad day. It was the condition of being cut off from meaning itself, of living inauthentically, of denying who you truly are. And he believed this despair could be fatal, not just for individuals, but for entire civilizations. If humanity loses its sense of meaning, if it buries itself in distractions and illusions, then extinction is not just biological, it becomes spiritual. A species can die from despair long before the body collapses. Here is the shock. Kierkegaard argued that despair is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like comfort. Sometimes it looks like people scrolling endlessly, chasing dopamine hits, drowning in distraction, avoiding the truth of existence. He called it the despair of weakness, when someone would rather numb themselves than confront what life demands. Imagine that on a global scale. Billions of humans lost in entertainment, consumerism, addictions of every kind, avoiding the question of why they exist. That is not life. It is sleepwalking toward extinction. And then there is the other kind of despair, the despair of defiance. This is when people know the truth, but reject it, when they sense meaning, but spit in its face, declaring life is absurd and nothing matters. This kind of despair can turn into rage, into destruction. You see it in movements that burn down institutions not to rebuild, but simply because the fire feels honest. You see it in leaders who play with annihilation as if destruction proves their power. When defiant despair spreads, humanity becomes not just reckless, but suicidal. Here is the validation. You can feel this despair creeping everywhere. Look around. Rates of depression and suicide rise in the wealthiest nations. Young people report feeling more hopeless than ever, even though material life is safer and richer than at any point in history. The more connected we are digitally, the more disconnected we feel spiritually. Kierkegaard saw it coming. He warned that despair was not about lacking resources, but about lacking a relationship to meaning. A starving person can cling to hope, but a comfortable person who sees no reason to exist is already halfway to collapse. Psychologists today echo his warning. They talk about existential vacuum, a condition where people feel empty despite having everything they need. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the camps, said people can endure almost any suffering if they have a why. But without a why, they collapse under even the smallest burdens. Extinction, then, may not come from external threats at all. It may come from a species that loses its why, that drowns in despair until it can no longer muster the will to survive. And here's the cruel twist. Modern technology accelerates despair. The endless scroll, the curated highlight reels, the shallow dopamine bursts, they all deepen the sense that life is hollow. Kierkegaard warned against living in what he called the aesthetic stage, where existence becomes about surface pleasures and distractions. He said it leads inevitably to despair. Today, entire economies are built to keep us trapped in that stage forever, consuming endlessly, avoiding silence, avoiding reflection. A civilization stuck in this state cannot endure. It collapses from within, hollowed out by despair. Think of climate change as an example. The science is clear. The warnings are everywhere. But despair shows up in two ways. One group numbs themselves and ignores it. The other embraces nihilism, saying nothing can be done, so burn it all down. Both are forms of fatal despair. Both prevent the honest confrontation that survival requires. Extinction becomes not just possible, but the logical endpoint of despair on a global scale. Kierkegaard did not leave us without hope. He believed despair could be overcome through what he called the leap of faith, a radical reorientation toward meaning that transcends reason alone. But here is the haunting question. Can a single individual make that leap? Yes. Can an entire species? That is less clear. And if humanity cannot rediscover meaning at the scale of billions, then despair may be the most fatal force we ever face. Not war, not plague, not famine, just the quiet corrosion of the soul until nothing matters enough to preserve. So here is the tension that Kierkegaard leaves us with. Will humanity continue numbing itself in weakness or raging in defiance, both forms of despair that end in collapse? Or is there some leap waiting, some rediscovery of meaning strong enough to break the spell? Because if despair is the sickness unto death, as Kierkegaard called it, then the question of extinction is not only about survival of the body, it is about survival of the spirit. And if the spirit dies, the body will not be far behind. Malthus on population doom. Thomas Malthus looked at humanity with a kind of brutal clarity. He was not concerned with the beauty of philosophy or the poetry of progress. He looked at people the way a farmer looks at grain, how fast it grows, how much land it takes, how quickly it devours resources. and what he saw terrified him. Populations, he said, do not grow gently. They explode. They double and double again, faster than the food supply can keep up. That gap between what people need and what the earth can give, that gap is where doom waits. Here's the shock. Malthus believed famine, disease, and war were not accidents but natural corrections. They were the brutal hand of balance slamming down whenever human growth outran resources. He argued that collapse was not an if but a when, because populations rise geometrically. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, while food rises arithmetically. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, 3 becomes 4. No matter how clever we think we are, he said, we will always hit the wall, and when we do, the suffering will be catastrophic. And you might want to laugh at him. After all, modern agriculture proved him wrong, didn't it? We found fertilizers, machines, genetically engineered crops. We fed billions he never imagined. But here is the haunting truth. We did not erase the Malthusian trap. We just delayed it. Every time we invent a new way to grow more food, populations surge again, demanding more. Every time we postpone the famine, we make the eventual crash even larger. The trap is not gone. It is just hiding, waiting for the next wall. You see the validation everywhere. The global population crossed 8 billion, and the pressure on resources is cracking the planet. Forests vanish to make farmland. Oceans empty to feed cities. Freshwater supplies are shrinking. Climate change itself is partly a Malthusian echo. Billions burning fossil fuels just to keep up with demand. We did not escape his logic. We made it planetary. Malthus said famine would come when food fell short. But now the collapse may come from the side effects of feeding so many in the first place. Psychologists call this optimism bias. Humans believe they will always find a solution, and it has carried us far. But optimism can also be the trap. It makes us believe the next breakthrough will save us. That technology will stretch the wall further. That collapse cannot happen because it has not happened yet. That is exactly what makes us vulnerable. Because the math is merciless. Infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible. At some point, something breaks. And here is where Malthus feels prophetic again. He said when resources tighten, inequality sharpens. The rich hoard food, the poor starve, and unrest turns into violence. You can already see glimpses of this in water wars, in migration crises, in the way scarcity fuels conflict. Collapse is not a single thunderclap. It is waves of instability that build until societies crack. The math of hunger turns into the politics of chaos. But here's the cruel irony. Humans hate limits. We live as if the future is infinite, as if the earth will always bend to our will. Malthus forced us to look at limits head on, and we hated him for it. Even today, his name is used like an insult. Nobody wants to believe in population doom. But ignoring it does not erase the wall. It just makes the crash harder when we hit it. And think about how extinction might fit into this. If collapse was once local, a famine here, a war there, today it is global. Supply chains link every nation. Crops fail in one region, and prices spike worldwide. Scarcity in one place triggers instability everywhere. A Malthusian crunch today would not starve one country. It could destabilize the entire species at once. A global famine, a global migration crisis, a global collapse. Not the small corrections Malthus described, but a terminal one. So here is the lingering fear. What if the greatest threat to humanity is not bombs or algorithms or asteroids? What if it is the simplest thing of all? Too many mouths, not enough food, and no way to balance the equation. That is Malthus's dark gift. He showed us that collapse is not mysterious. It is mathematical. And if the numbers do not add up, extinction does not need an enemy. It only needs us to keep growing until the earth says no. Gnostic world trap. The Gnostics had a terrifying idea about reality. They said the world itself was a trap. Not a garden, not a gift, not a stage for human flourishing, but a prison built to keep souls chained. According to their vision, the universe was created not by a benevolent God, but by a false ruler, a blind craftsman, a kind of cosmic fraud. This being filled the world with beauty and pleasure to keep us distracted, while hiding the truth that our real essence is divine, meant for something beyond all this. To the Gnostics, life as we know it is not freedom, it is captivity. And here is where the shock lands. If you look at the world through that lens, extinction is not a nightmare. It is an escape. The endless wars, the addictions, the consumer treadmill, the technological cages we keep building, these are not accidents. They are the bars of the prison. Every new distraction, every new dependency, every shiny device that glues us to screens feels like another lock on the cell door. The Gnostics warned that humanity would not just stumble into destruction. We would willingly tighten our own chains, loving the prison so much we would forget it was killing us. Think about how this plays out in modern life. People wake up to alarms set on glowing rectangles. They rush into traffic. They work jobs they often despise. They buy things to impress people they barely know. They scroll through endless feeds chasing connection that never satisfies. Then they collapse into bed, drained, only to repeat the cycle. This is not freedom. This is the world as trap, and the cruelest part is how normal it feels. The cage does not need iron bars. It just needs habits that nobody questions. Psychologists today describe something eerily close to this in the concept of learned helplessness. When people are trapped long enough, when they fail enough times to break free, they stop trying altogether. They accept the cage. They adapt to it. They even defend it. That is what the Gnostics feared most, that humanity would forget it was trapped at all, that we would lose the memory of transcendence, the hunger for something higher. Once that happens, collapse is not just physical, it is spiritual extinction. And here's where the warning sharpens. If the world is a trap, then progress itself may be part of the snare. Every time we think we are advancing, we may just be weaving the net tighter. More technology, more surveillance, more systems we depend on, more disconnection from the raw experience of being alive. Gnostics would say the archons, the rulers of this false world, are winning, because humanity now guards its own prison with pride. We think the cage is paradise, when really it is suffocation. You can already feel the weight of this in how people talk about burnout, anxiety, and alienation. Despite unprecedented wealth, depression rises. Despite infinite connectivity, loneliness spreads. Despite freedom on paper, most feel enslaved to schedules, debt, and endless obligations. The trap does not need to kill us with violence. It kills us with emptiness, with despair. A species that forgets its essence is already halfway to extinction. The Gnostics offered a path out. Gnosis, the awakening to the truth. But that awakening came with risk. To see the world as a trap means to reject its false comforts, to peel away the illusions of wealth, pleasure, and power. That is not easy. It feels like tearing away part of yourself, and that is why most never escape. Most would rather stay in the trap than confront the terror of freedom. If you want a modern picture, think of someone unplugging from a digital life of distraction. It feels unbearable at first, like losing oxygen. But what they are really losing is the drug of the prison. So here is the ultimate tease, the chilling possibility. Maybe extinction is not the end of humanity at all. Maybe it is the end of the trap. Maybe what we call collapse is really escape. Souls breaking free from the false world when the prison finally cracks under its own weight. To the Gnostic imagination, the greatest danger is not that we die, but that we never wake up before we do. If the world is a trap, then the question is not whether humanity survives, but whether humanity ever remembers what it was before the prison was built. Schopenhauer's Pessimism. Arthur Schopenhauer looked at life and said something that people still recoil from today. He said existence itself is suffering. Not just sometimes, not just when things go wrong, but at its very core. He believed every living thing is driven by what he called the will, the blind force of desire, the endless hunger to survive, reproduce, dominate, consume. And because the will never stops, because it is never satisfied, life is condemned to be restless and painful. Even when you get what you want, the relief is temporary. Soon a new desire takes its place, and the cycle starts again. For Schopenhauer, this wasn't just depressing. It was proof that life itself is a trap. Here's the shock. If the very engine of life is suffering, then what happens when billions of people, all ruled by this insatiable will, collide on a single planet with limited resources? Schopenhauer thought the answer was obvious: conflict, misery, and collapse. The will does not care about harmony. It only cares about feeding itself. Every act of progress only creates new desires, which means new frustrations. Even the greatest achievements of civilization, science, art, wealth, are not escapes from suffering. They are ornaments draped over an abyss. Humanity may build wonders, but beneath it all lies endless hunger, endless pain. And doesn't that feel disturbingly familiar? Look at modern consumer culture. Entire economies are built on inflaming desire, convincing people they need more, faster, newer, better. The phone you bought last year is obsolete. The job you just landed is not enough. The house you live in is too small. The will is never silent. And the more a society obeys it, the more frantic it becomes. People burn themselves out chasing goals that dissolve the moment they're reached. Nations compete for resources, power, dominance, always driven by that same force. Multiply that restlessness by billions, and extinction stops looking like an accident. It starts looking like the logical conclusion of desire that knows no end. Schopenhauer validated his dark vision with the simplest observation: if life were truly good, we would not fear death so much. If existence were truly satisfying, people would not be so restless, so desperate for distraction, so prone to addiction and despair. He pointed to boredom as one of the clearest signs. When life is too painful, we suffer. When life is too comfortable, we are bored. Either way, existence feels unbearable, and so the will pushes us forward, demanding more, demanding change, never allowing peace. Humanity, then, is not marching toward utopia. It is staggering in circles, whipped forward by a master it cannot escape. Psychologists today echo parts of this. Hedonic adaptation, the way happiness quickly fades after we achieve something, is basically Schopenhauer's will dressed in modern terms. You win the lottery, and in time you feel just as restless as before. You fall in love, and the thrill fades into daily frustration. No matter how much you feed desire, the hunger comes back. And when entire civilizations run on that treadmill, the result is exhaustion at best, collapse at worst. But Schopenhauer didn't stop at analysis. He asked the question: if existence is suffering, what should we do? And here is where his philosophy becomes even darker. He believed the highest wisdom was to negate the will, to turn away from desire altogether. Asceticism, compassion, art. These were ways of quieting the will, of stepping outside the cycle for a moment. He admired Buddhism for this reason, the idea that release comes not from grasping, but from letting go. Yet even he admitted it was nearly impossible for most people. The will is too strong. Civilization itself is built to inflame it, not extinguish it, which means the majority of humanity will never escape suffering, and in its endless hunger, it may destroy itself entirely. And think about that in terms of extinction. if desire never ends, then even if we solve today's crisis, climate change, overpopulation, resource wars, we will invent new ones. Because the will not allow satisfaction, we will push technology further, push consumption further, push risk further, until one day the gamble ends in collapse. In Schopenhauer's vision, doom is not a bug of human existence. It is the feature. It is what happens when a species cannot stop wanting more. So here is the tease. What if extinction is not something to fear, but the final act of the will consuming itself? What if the collapse of humanity is the moment the trap breaks, when the endless hunger finally ends because there are no more mouths left to feed? Schopenhauer would not celebrate extinction, but he might see in it a grim kind of release, the only true escape from a life built on suffering. And that forces the question back on us. If the will is endless and desire is the path to ruin, then is there any chance at survival that does not involve learning how to let go? Daoist balance reset. The Daoists whispered something radically different from most philosophies. They said the universe is not a battlefield to conquer, but a balance to keep. To them, life is not about control or domination, but harmony, living in step with the Tao, the flow of nature, the rhythm of opposites. Where others saw progress as endless building, Daoists saw it as endless imbalance, because every time you push too hard in one direction, the pendulum swings back. Here is the shock. If you take Daoist wisdom seriously, then human extinction is not just a possibility. It may be the inevitable reset of balance. Humanity has lived for centuries as if the Tao is irrelevant, as if growth can be infinite, as if we can burn forests, poison oceans, and bend the climate without consequence. But to the Taoist mind, imbalance cannot last. Push too far, and nature does not argue. It corrects. And when the correction comes, it is not gentle. It is collapse. Think of the Taoist symbol everyone knows. The circle of yin and yang. It is not just a pretty design. It is the law of opposites. Where there is light, darkness grows. Where there is order, chaos builds. Where there is expansion, contraction waits. Humanity has been living in yang for centuries. Aggression, expansion, technology, industry, speed. But yin has been gathering quietly, soil exhaustion, rising seas, dying species, exhausted people. At some point, the balance flips, and the correction is brutal. That flip is what Taoists would call the Great Reset, and what we might experience as extinction. Modern science has its own language for this, but it rhymes with Taoism. Ecologists call it overshoot and collapse. When a species takes more from its environment than the environment can regenerate, it thrives for a time, then crashes hard. Deer that overgraze a forest, bacteria that overpopulate a dish, humans who burn through resources like they are infinite. In every case, the reset is swift and unforgiving. Taoism captured that truth centuries before biology gave it charts and models. And you can feel the validation in human behavior itself. Think about burnout. People push themselves harder and harder. Longer hours, bigger goals, endless productivity, until their bodies shut down. That is Taoist imbalance written on a personal scale. Now stretch it to a species level, and the same rule applies. We push civilization harder and harder until the earth itself burns out. Balance always returns, whether we choose it or not. The trap is that humans mistake imbalance for strength. We think constant motion means progress, constant growth means success, constant consumption means life. But Taoists warn that too much yang burns itself out, like a fire that consumes its own fuel. Too much yin smothers into stagnation, like water flooding the land. Only balance allows continuity. Without it, the system resets, and that reset does not ask for permission. Psychologists even see this in our nervous systems. The body has two gears, sympathetic for action, parasympathetic for rest. Too much of one, and you collapse. Too much of the other, and you wither. Health means oscillating between both. Humanity as a collective is stuck in overdrive, running hot, never resting, never slowing. It is the nervous system of an entire planet heading toward breakdown. Taoism is not just ancient poetry. It is biology, psychology, ecology, all saying the same thing: imbalance is suicide. So what does this mean for extinction? From a Daoist view, collapse is not punishment, it is medicine. It is the body of the universe forcing balance back where it belongs. If humans cannot live within the Tao will live without humans. Nature does not cling to us. It resets. The rivers run again, the forests regrow, the climate stabilizes in its own way. Extinction may not be an apocalypse at all. It may be the earth taking a deep breath after the fever of humanity breaks. And here is the haunting tease. Maybe the question is not whether humans can prevent extinction. Maybe the question is whether humans can remember balance before the reset comes. Because the Tao does not bargain. It does not wait for us to catch up. It does not care about our technology or ambition. It simply restores harmony. The choice is whether we return to balance willingly, or whether balance returns without us. Heraclitus' eternal fire. Heraclitus, the old Greek who loved riddles, once said the world is fire. Not just literal flames, but a cosmic fire, an eternal process of burning, consuming, and renewing. To him, everything was change, and change was conflict. You cannot step into the same river twice, he said, because the river is always moving, and so are you. For Heraclitus, this constant flux was not a problem to solve. It was the truth of reality itself. The fire is always burning. Now here is the shock. If the world is an eternal fire, then humanity is just kindling. Civilizations rise like sparks, flare brightly, then burn out. We may think we are building permanence, but Heraclitus would laugh at the idea. He would say the very fuel of our progress is what guarantees our destruction. Every skyscraper, every power plant, every network humming with energy, these are flames leaping higher, feeding on themselves. The brighter we burn, the faster we turn to ash. Look around today and you can feel it. Humanity has built an economy that runs on fire, literally. Fossil fuels pulled from the earth, forests cut and burned, endless combustion engines driving our lives forward. The planet itself is heating, the atmosphere thick with the smoke of progress. If Heraclitus walked among us now, he would not be surprised. He would say, of course it ends this way. Fire feeds on itself until there is nothing left. Collapse is not an interruption of the eternal fire. It is the fire's law playing out. And the disturbing part is how natural this feels. People celebrate fire. We call it innovation, ambition, growth. We want the flames to leap higher, faster technology, bigger industries, more consumption. But Heraclitus would warn that the same energy driving creation also drives destruction. In his vision, war and strife were not accidents but the engine of reality. He called it the father of all things. Without conflict, nothing moves. Without tension, nothing changes. Which means extinction may not come from an external blow, but from the very fire that gave us life. Psychologists see a similar pattern in human behavior. Stress, competition, ambition, they push people to achieve. But push too far, and those same forces burn them out. The fire that fuels becomes the fire that destroys. Civilizations act the same way. Rome expanded until it collapsed. Empires stretch thin, overheat, and disintegrate. The eternal fire does not allow stability. It demands transformation, and sometimes that transformation looks like ruin. Heraclitus of philosophy validates what we already sense in our bones, that nothing lasts. Relationships shift, bodies age, nations crumble, species vanish. We cling to permanence, but fire does not permit it. He would say the real delusion is imagining humanity could somehow build a stable, permanent order. Extinction is not the violation of cosmic law, it is the fulfillment of it. The fire burns on, with or without us. And here is the part most people miss. For Heraclitus, this was not despair. He saw the fire as divine, as sacred order. What looks to us like chaos and collapse is really the cosmos balancing itself. The destruction of one thing is the birth of another. The ash of forests becomes the soil for new life. The collapse of civilizations clears space for new ones. Even extinction itself may just be fuel for whatever comes next in the eternal blaze. To fear it is to misunderstand it. But here is the tease, the chilling thought that lingers. If fire is the law of reality, then the end of humanity may not even matter. The fire will go on. The earth will shift. The cosmos will burn and renew in endless cycles. To Heraclitus, we are not exceptions. We are sparks. Sparks do not argue with the fire. Sparks do not outlast it. They flare. They vanish. And the flame continues. So the question becomes not how do we stop the fire, but whether we can live knowing that we are only ever fuel for it. Icarus as tech metaphor. The myth of Icarus is one of those stories we hear as kids and shrug off. But when you really think about it, it is terrifyingly close to what we are doing right now. Icarus was the boy who flew too high. His father, Daedalus, crafted wings of feathers and wax so they could escape imprisonment. The wings worked, but Daedalus gave a warning. Do not fly too low, or the sea will drown you. Do not fly too high, or the sun will melt the wax. Find the balance in between. But Icarus, drunk on the thrill of flight, soared higher and higher until the sun melted his wings. He fell into the sea and disappeared. The end. Now here is the shock. Humanity is Icarus. Technology is our wings, and just like him, we are drunk on the thrill of flight. We went from fire to cities, from steam to rockets, from printing presses to artificial intelligence in the blink of an eye. Every breakthrough makes us feel unstoppable. But Daedalus' warning still echoes. Stay balanced or you burn. We are ignoring it. We are flying straight toward the sun. Think about nuclear power. It gave us energy on a scale we had never dreamed of. It also gave us weapons that can end civilization in an afternoon. Think about artificial intelligence. It promises to cure diseases, automate labor, even solve climate change. It also carries the possibility of mass unemployment, runaway algorithms, or machines that outpace our control. Even biotechnology, even space exploration. Every leap upward has shadows that grow longer as we climb, and the higher we go, the less room we have to fall. The validation for this metaphor is everywhere. Psychologists know that human beings are wired for novelty and reward. We are drawn to progress like moths to light, constantly chasing what is new without fully weighing the cost. It is called the optimism bias, the tendency to believe that disasters happen to other people, not to us. Icarus had it. We have it too. He thought the sun could not burn him. We think extinction cannot burn us. But the laws of reality do not bend to bias. Wax melts whether you believe in it or not. And what makes this story brutal is that Daedalus warned him. Warnings are always there. Scientists warn us about climate change. Ethicists warn us about AI. Historians warn us about empire and collapse. But warnings are boring compared to the thrill of flight. Humans, like Icarus, are captivated by the sensation of ascent. The faster the wings beat, the more alive we feel. Slowing down feels like death. But it is not slowing down that kills. It is ignoring the balance. Even our language reveals the trap. We celebrate moonshots, breakthroughs, revolutions. We rarely celebrate restraint. Companies are rewarded for disruption, not for saying we should pause. Politicians win by promising growth, not by urging balance. And so the wings grow bigger, the sun grows closer, and no one wants to be the one who shouts. We are flying too high, until the wax begins to drip. There is also a tragic inevitability in the myth. Icarus could not help himself. The exhilaration of flight was too much. And maybe humanity is the same. Maybe technology is not something we control, but something that carries us upward whether we like it or not. Once the wings exist, someone will use them. Once the fire burns, someone will reach for it. We like to imagine we are steering the flight, but maybe the wings themselves are steering us. If that is true, then the fall is not just possible, it is inevitable. But here is the tease, the haunting part that lingers. In the story, Icarus falls and disappears, but the sun goes on shining, the sea goes on moving, the world does not notice. His story is not one of triumph but of warning. Maybe humanity's fate will be the same. A species that flew higher than it should, melted its own wings, and vanished into the waves of history. The earth will keep spinning. Life will find new forms. The sky will still shine. The only question left is whether we realize we are Icarus in time to change the story, or whether we are already too close to the sun to turn back. Rousseau on civilization's corruption. Rousseau had this unsettling idea that flips our entire notion of progress upside down. He said that civilization, the thing we worship as our greatest achievement, might actually be our greatest downfall. He believed humans in their natural state, what he called the state of nature, were simple, healthy, even noble. But once we started building cities, piling up possessions, and chasing status, we lost that purity. We gained comfort, sure, but we also gained envy, greed, inequality, and corruption. Civilization, in his eyes, was not salvation. It was decay dressed up as advancement. And here is the shock. If Rousseau was right, then the very thing we cling to for survival, the growth of civilization itself, is the force that drives us toward extinction. Think about it. Every skyscraper, every industrial farm, every digital empire, we think these are signs of progress. Rousseau would say they are symptoms of disease. Civilization seduces us with luxuries, but in exchange, it enslaves us to desires that never end. It creates endless competition, endless scarcity, endless division, until eventually, the whole system collapses under its own corruption. You can already see it happening. Technology gives us convenience, but it also breeds isolation. Wealth gives us abundance, but it also amplifies inequality. Political systems promise order, but they spiral into polarization and mistrust. Rousseau's warning was that civilization does not solve problems. It manufactures them. And every layer of complexity we add, every invention we celebrate, every institution we worship, it all pushes us further away from the balance we once had and deeper into a fragile machine that can one day snap. The psychological validation is everywhere. Humans are wired for comparison. Social scientists call it relative deprivation. It is the pain of feeling less than others, even if you have enough. Civilization supercharges this instinct. In the wild, a hunter might envy another's meal. In society, we envy fortunes, lifestyles, followers, entire identities. The hunger never ends. And when hunger never ends, societies stretch further and further to satisfy it, burning through resources, exhausting people, consuming the planet. Rousseau would point at modern collapse and say, "This is exactly what I meant. Civilization corrupts. Even our pursuit of knowledge," Rousseau argued, was not innocent. He claimed the arts and sciences, while celebrated, were luxuries that bloomed only after society had already gone soft. They gave us beauty, yes, but also vanity and distraction. Today, you could say the same about social media, entertainment, even some technologies. They dazzle us, but they also trap us in shallow desires, leaving us weaker, more distracted, and more vulnerable to ruin. We think information saves us. Rousseau would say it enslaves us to appearances and illusions. And the most haunting part of his argument is that corruption is not an accident. It is baked into civilization itself. Once humans start comparing, once we start owning, once we start chasing status, there is no return to innocence. The corruption deepens generation after generation. First envy, then greed, then inequality, then oppression, then collapse. Civilization carries its own seed of death, planted from the very first step away from simplicity. You can see echoes of Rousseau's fear in modern science too. Anthropologists study early hunter-gatherers and find that they often lived healthier, freer, and more equal lives than many of the farming societies that followed. They had fewer possessions but less inequality. They worked fewer hours but had stronger communities. Civilization promised abundance but delivered hierarchy, slavery, and exploitation. In many ways, Rousseau was not just speculating. He was diagnosing a historical pattern that has played out over and over. And here is the tease, the part that stings. Rousseau might say that extinction is not some external disaster waiting to strike us. It is simply the final stage of corruption. Civilization is like a machine that cannot stop corroding. The question is not if it breaks, but when. Humanity may believe it is climbing toward perfection, toward mastery of the world. But in Rousseau's eyes, we are only climbing higher on a tower of corruption, and the higher it goes, the harder the fall will be when it crumbles. Stoic heat death of universe. The Stoics had this strange, almost brutal comfort about the end of everything. They believed the universe was not eternal in the way we think. To them, the cosmos itself was alive, it breathed in cycles. It was born in fire, it burned, it collapsed, and then it was reborn again. This endless loop was called ekpyrosis, the great cosmic fire that would eventually consume all things. Not just people, not just cities, but the stars, the planets, even time as we know it. Imagine that for a second. Everything you see, everything you know, everything you dream of, all of it destined to burn back into cosmic ash, only to start again. Now here is the shock. Modern science has its own version of this prophecy, and it is even colder. The Stoics imagined fire, but physics points toward something worse, the heat death of the universe. A time when all stars burn out, all energy spreads thin, and the cosmos itself reaches maximum entropy. No light, no warmth, no movement, just endless nothing stretching forever. The Stoics thought the world would end in fire, but the universe seems destined to end in ice. Either way, the story is the same: everything vanishes. The extinction of humanity is not just probable, it is guaranteed. And this is where the Stoic mindset hits hard. Instead of despairing, they leaned into acceptance. They would say, "What did you expect? You are mortal. So is the world. Nothing escapes impermanence." To fight against that is madness. The Stoic practice was to meditate on loss, to remind themselves daily that everything they loved could vanish, not as punishment, but as liberation. If you accept that all things end, then you stop clinging, you stop fearing, you live with clarity because you know the fire is coming. There is actually psychological validation for this. Studies show that people who regularly confront thoughts of death often live with more focus and gratitude. It is called terror management theory, the paradox that by facing mortality, you reduce its grip on you. The Stoics were doing this 2,000 years ago. They were not waiting for the universe to collapse to practice acceptance. They used the idea of cosmic death to sharpen their lives in the present. You and I may panic at the thought of extinction. A Stoic would say, "Good. Now stop panicking and ask what you will do with the time you still have. But think about how terrifying this perspective really is. Everything we build, our nations, our art, our knowledge, even our survival instincts, they are all temporary ripples in a universe that does not care." To the Stoics, the destruction of the cosmos was not injustice. It was order. Fire consumes, fire renews, fire repeats. To modern physics, entropy consumes, Entropy spreads, entropy wins. Either way, human extinction is not a tragedy in cosmic terms. It is just one small step in the natural unraveling of everything. And here is the haunting part. We like to think that if we avoid nuclear war, if we survive climate change, if we colonize space, we might cheat extinction. But the Stoics would smirk at that. Escape one fire, another will find you. Expand into the stars, and one day the stars themselves will die. We are not exceptions. We are temporary arrangements of atoms in a temporary cosmos. The fire does not ask for our permission. The heat death does not wait for us to be ready. The universe will end on its own clock, not ours. Still, the Stoics would not tell you to despair. They would tell you to act. Live in harmony with nature. Accept what you cannot change. Focus on what is within your control, not on the collapse of galaxies. They believed virtue was the only true good, and virtue could be practiced even while the universe burned. That was their defiance. Even knowing that everything ends, you can still live well, right now, in this fleeting spark of existence. And here is the tease that lingers like a shadow. If the Stoics are right, then extinction is not a threat on the horizon. It is the natural end of all things. The only real question left is not how do we prevent the collapse, but how do we live knowing the collapse is inevitable? Can we carry the weight of that knowledge without breaking? Or are we, like most, destined to look away until the fire arrives or the stars go dark? Postmodern collapse of truth. There is a quiet fear running underneath our age, and it is not war or climate or technology. It is the collapse of truth itself. Postmodern thinkers pointed at the foundations of knowledge and said, what if truth is not absolute? What if it is just a construction shaped by culture, by language, by power? And once that idea took hold, it cracked the ground beneath us. Because if truth is not solid, then nothing is. Society becomes a house standing on quicksand. Now here is the shock. We are living in that collapse right now. Scroll through your phone and you will see it. Conspiracy theories spreading like wildfire. Deepfakes blurring the line between real and fake. Politicians bending facts until they snap. Corporations selling narratives instead of reality. Everyone building their own version of truth and defending it like a fortress. The result is chaos. Without shared truth, there is no shared world. And without a shared world, civilization itself starts to unravel. Think about what holds a society together. It is not just laws or armies. It is agreement. Agreement that the money in your pocket has value. Agreement that elections are real. Agreement that science is trustworthy. If those agreements fracture, the machinery of civilization jams. Postmodernists saw this coming. They warned that once truth becomes relative, power fills the vacuum. Whoever controls the loudest megaphone, the strongest platform, the most seductive story, controls reality, and that is where we are. Truth is no longer discovered. It is manufactured. The psychology here is brutal but real. Humans are wired for tribal truth. Our brains evolved not to see objective reality, but to survive inside groups. We align our beliefs with our tribe, even if those beliefs are absurd, because belonging keeps us alive. In a fragmented digital age, there are thousands of tribes, thousands of realities, all colliding at once. Postmodernism did not create this, but it gave us the lens to see it. And once you see it, you realize how fragile everything really is. The validation is everywhere in history. When civilizations collapse, it is often not because of a single disaster, but because people stop agreeing on what is real. Rome fell not just from invasions, but from corruption, distrust, and the disintegration of common values. The French Revolution descended into terror when competing truths shredded the social fabric. Even now, the biggest danger is not one bomb or one plague. It is the slow corrosion of shared reality. Because once people no longer trust each other's words, contracts dissolve, institutions rot, and violence becomes the only language left. And here is the part that stings. We celebrate freedom of perspective, the idea that everyone can have their own truth. It sounds liberating, but taken to the extreme, it becomes poison. If every truth is equal, then lies are equal too. If nothing can be trusted, then nothing can be held accountable. The collapse of truth does not make us free. It makes us powerless, adrift in a storm of narratives where the strongest manipulator wins. You can feel it in your own life. You hear one headline, then the opposite headline. One expert says the world is ending, another says everything is fine. You see videos that look real but are fake, and fakes that are called real. Your brain gets exhausted, and at some point, you stop asking what is true. You just choose the version of reality that feels comfortable, that flatters your tribe, that eases your fear. That is the postmodern trap. It is not just philosophical, it is personal. It is in your scrolling, in your arguing, in your daily doubt. The postmodernists were not cheering for collapse. They were diagnosing it. They were saying, if you dismantle the scaffolding of truth, you better be ready for what comes next, because humans cannot live in pure uncertainty. We crave foundations, and when we cannot find them in truth, we build them out of power, fear, or myth. That is why authoritarian regimes thrive in chaos. That is why conspiracy cults explode in popularity. That is why trust in institutions is evaporating. When truth collapses, force takes its place. And here is the tease, the question that gnaws at us. If we are already watching the collapse of truth, what comes after? Do we rebuild some new foundation, some shared framework that can hold us together? Or do we descend further into fractured realities until civilization itself cannot hold? Postmodernism opened the door. The question is whether we walk through it toward renewal, or whether we are already lost in the maze of illusions with no way back. Utilitarianism's extinction choice, picture this. You are given a button. If you press it, humanity ends instantly. No suffering, no slow decay, no wars or famines, just silence. If you do not press it, billions more people will be born into a future of pain, climate chaos, conflict, inequality, and possibly a violent end anyway. What do you do? Most of us recoil at the question. But utilitarianism, the philosophy of maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering, forces us to stare it in the face. Here is the shock. Utilitarian logic can lead to extinction being the moral choice. Because if the future of humanity contains more suffering than happiness, then the math says ending it now prevents unimaginable pain later. The cold calculation does not care about our sentimentality. It asks, what produces the greatest net balance of well-being? And if survival means trillions of lives filled with misery, then extinction starts looking less like tragedy and more like mercy. That is a horrifying conclusion. But it is not just a thought experiment. You can see echoes of it in debates happening right now. Climate scientists warn of feedback loops leading to unlivable conditions. Artificial intelligence researchers warn of systems that could spiral out of control. Philosophers like David Benatar argue that bringing new humans into existence is unethical because existence itself guarantees suffering. Utilitarian reasoning magnifies these fears. It does not ask if we can survive. It asks if we should. And it gets even darker when you think about the asymmetry. One extinction event erases all future suffering. Billions of births guarantee more of it. Utilitarian math is merciless. It does not matter that humans create art and beauty. It does not matter that we love, dream, and imagine. If the ledger of suffering outweighs the ledger of joy, then continuing the species is a net harm. Suddenly, the moral high ground might belong not to the people fighting to save humanity, but to the people asking if humanity deserves to continue at all. Psychology validates how disturbing this really is. Humans are wired for optimism bias. We overestimate the future being better, even when evidence points the other way. It is a survival instinct. It keeps us moving forward. But utilitarianism cuts through optimism with brutal clarity. It forces us to confront numbers, probabilities, and outcomes without the comforting lies we tell ourselves. If your bias says it will all work out, utilitarianism asks, based on what? If the suffering continues to scale, what exactly are you defending? History also gives us a cruel reflection. Look at moments when societies chose survival at all costs. Wars justified in the name of the greater good. Sacrifices of entire generations to preserve some imagined future. Utilitarian logic has been used to defend horrific actions because it reduces morality to a ledger. And yet, it also exposes the uncomfortable truth that sometimes survival creates more harm than ending. Think of invasive species introduced to new ecosystems. They flourish, but in doing so, they destroy everything else. Humanity could be playing that same role on a planetary scale. But the paradox is this. While utilitarianism might justify extinction, it also drives us to prevent it. Because if humanity can shift its trajectory, if we can reduce suffering through technology, ethics, and compassion, then survival regains its moral weight. The same math that condemns us also offers salvation. Every step toward less suffering, curing disease, preventing famine, reducing inequality, tips the scale back toward life being worth living. Utilitarianism is not cheering for our extinction. It is daring us to prove it wrong. And here is the haunting tease that lingers. What if we fail? What if the centuries ahead contain more misery than joy, more despair than wonder, more collapse than creation? Would we still fight for survival out of instinct? Or would we have the courage to admit the moral choice was to let go? Utilitarianism does not answer for us. It only holds up the mirror. It shows us the calculation we are too afraid to make. And maybe the most terrifying possibility is that the math already has an answer, and we just do not want to see it. Epicurus and atomic fall. Epicurus lived more than 2,000 years ago, but he had this unsettling idea that sounds like it was ripped out of a physics textbook. He believed the universe was made of tiny, indivisible particles, atoms, falling endlessly through the void, no gods steering them, no fate pulling strings, just matter colliding and rearranging itself. And in that vision, humanity was not central, not sacred. We were just an accident of atoms bumping into each other. That was his comfort. He used it to dissolve the fear of death. But hidden in that picture is also a shadow. If life is built from random atomic collisions, then life can also vanish by them. Here is the shock. Epicurus's ancient atomism looks eerily like modern physics, and if we follow it forward, it predicts the same kind of extinction he never fully spelled out. We now know atoms hold terrifying energy. The nuclear bomb is the most literal proof that atomic fall can erase civilization in a flash. But it is not just weapons. Cosmic radiation, asteroid impacts, or even a stray burst from a dying star could disrupt the atomic balance that makes Earth livable. The very building blocks that give us life can just as easily end it. The universe does not need malice to destroy us. Blind atoms are enough. Epicurus used atomism to free people from the grip of fear. He said, "Do not worry about God's punishing you. Do not fear eternal torment. Death is just atoms dispersing back into the void." But that same thought, in a modern world, becomes far darker. If everything is only atoms in motion, then extinction is not just possible, it is inevitable. Whether it comes from our own nuclear trigger or the slow unraveling of cosmic order, nothing in the structure of atoms promises permanence. Everything is fragile. Everything is temporary. and psychology proves how fragile we are in facing that truth. Humans crave meaning. Our brains rebel against randomness. We invent stories, religions, and myths to soften the terror of being accidents in a cold void. Studies show people under stress are more likely to believe in purposeful forces at work, even when shown random patterns. It is called the agency detection bias. Epicurus was stripping that away, saying there is no cosmic plan, only atoms. But take away the comfort of meaning, and you expose the raw terror that the fall of atoms can erase us without reason, without warning, without justice. History shows how real that threat has become. In the 20th century, the discovery of splitting the atom gave us not just energy, but the ability to annihilate ourselves. For the first time, extinction was not a myth or prophecy. It was a button on a desk. The Cold War brought humanity to the edge of atomic fall. Even today, stockpiles of nuclear weapons sit ready to erase cities in minutes. Epicurus wanted atomism to be liberating, but he could never have imagined a future where the very knowledge of atoms put survival in constant jeopardy. And it goes deeper. Epicurus argued that atoms sometimes swerved unpredictably. A little twist in their fall he called the clinamen. That swerve, he said, explained why the universe was not pure determinism, why freedom and creativity could exist. But imagine that same swerve scaled up. A tiny random event, one flicker of chance in the atomic dance, can cascade into collapse. A mutation in a virus, a glitch in a reactor, a stray particle triggering a chain reaction. The clinamen, that little twist of freedom, can just as easily be the twist of destruction. But Epicurus would not have wanted despair to be the lesson. He believed peace came from acceptance. If life is just atoms, then enjoy the simple pleasures while you have them. Friendship, good food, tranquility of mind. He was not pushing for panic, but for perspective. In his eyes, even if atoms fall and humanity collapses, the void remains calm. There is no punishment, no eternal nightmare. There is just dissolution, a return to the quiet background of existence. That was his strange gift, reminding us that the universe does not mourn, so maybe we should not either. And yet, here is the lingering tease. If Epicurus was right, if all we are is atoms in motion, then extinction is not an if but a when. The question is not whether atoms will one day scatter us, but whether we can build a life worth living in the short space between collisions. Can we carry the weight of knowing everything ends without crumbling under it? Or will we keep hiding in stories, hoping the atoms will give us more time than they were ever meant to? Leibniz's best world paradox. Leibniz had this bold, almost outrageous claim. He believed we live in the best of all possible worlds. Not just a good one, not just a tolerable one, but the best one that God, being perfect, could have created. Every disaster, every injustice, every heartbreak was, in some cosmic accounting, part of the design that led to the greatest overall balance. It was a philosophy of radical optimism. But hidden inside that optimism is a paradox that sounds less like comfort and more like a death sentence. Here is the shock. If this really is the best possible world, then the end of humanity must also be part of that perfection. Think about that. Every plague, every war, every collapse, every extinction event, if they happen, they are not accidents. They are features of the best design, which means our downfall, no matter how violent or tragic, could be justified under Leibniz's logic. It is not just allowed, it is necessary. The perfection of the universe might require us to vanish. That idea hits like a punch because it flips optimism into horror. We usually imagine perfection as eternal life, endless progress, harmony that never ends. But Leibniz's best world is not designed for our comfort. It is designed for some incomprehensible balance that includes both beauty and ruin. In that equation, our survival may not be the point. Our extinction could be the very thing that makes the cosmic puzzle complete. Psychology tells us why this is so hard to accept. Humans have what researchers call a just world bias. We want to believe the universe is fair, that suffering leads to growth, that hard times are rewarded, that the story arcs toward justice. Leibniz fed that craving, but he took it to an extreme. He said not only is the universe just, but every horror contributes to a greater harmony. But history shows how brutal that logic can become. After the Lisbon earthquake in 1755 killed tens of thousands, many used Leibniz's philosophy to argue it was somehow necessary, somehow part of a greater good. But Voltaire called this out as absurd. He wrote Candide to mock the optimism, showing a world of relentless suffering dressed up as divine perfection. Here is the validation. If you look at nature through a certain lens, Leibniz does not seem entirely wrong. Ecosystems thrive on cycles of life and death. Forests burn so new growth can emerge. Species vanish so others can adapt. Collapse feeds renewal. The universe does not operate on kindness, it operates on balance. Our extinction could simply be part of that balancing act, a planet recovering from the damage we inflicted, a reset that opens space for something new. Seen from a cold cosmic distance, maybe that really is the best outcome. And yet we recoil, because optimism has always been our survival drug. It pushes us forward against impossible odds. Even in despair, humans cling to hope, because giving up means death. But Leibniz's paradox whispers something unnerving. What if hope is not aligned with reality? What if the perfection of the universe requires an ending we cannot stop? It is not pessimism, it is destiny written into the structure of the best world. The danger of this idea is not just philosophical, it is psychological. If people believe every tragedy is justified, they stop resisting. Suffering becomes acceptable, even necessary. Extinction becomes not a horror to prevent, but a fate to accept. And that passivity can itself lead to collapse. If we shrug at climate change, at nuclear risks, at technological overload, because we think the universe will sort it out, then we are handing extinction the keys. That is the dark side of Leibniz's optimism. It can turn into a surrender disguised as faith. But the paradox cuts both ways. Because if this really is the best possible world, then maybe even our struggle against extinction is part of the perfection. Maybe our resistance, our fight for survival, our refusal to accept collapse is itself woven into the cosmic design. Maybe the best world includes us clawing for meaning even when the void stares back. That tension between acceptance and resistance is the essence of the paradox. And here is the haunting tease. If Leibniz was right, then we cannot escape perfection. Whether we survive or vanish, the outcome is already the best it could possibly be. But what does that mean for us, here and now? Do we relax, trusting that collapse is somehow part of the design? Or do we fight tooth and nail, believing that resistance itself is the role we were meant to play? Leibniz leaves us with a choice that is not really a choice at all. Either way, perfection swallows us. The only question is whether we walk toward it blind with optimism, or clear-eyed, knowing the best of all possible worlds might also be our last. Augustine on sinful cycles. Augustine did not see history as progress. He saw it as repetition. A cycle of human pride, sin, collapse, and the same mistakes rising again. In his view, no empire, no nation, no civilization escapes this, because the root problem is not politics or technology or wealth. It is the human heart. Every time we think we are building something new, something stronger, we are really just rewrapping the same flaw. Pride swells, sin spreads, collapse follows, and then the cycle restarts. That was his warning. And here is the shock. If Augustine is right, extinction is not an accident waiting in the future. It is the inevitable final spin of the cycle. Because if sin is hardwired into us, then every attempt to rise will eventually fall, each new system poisoned by the same pride that tore down the last. Rome fell, not because of barbarians, Augustine said, but because of its moral rot. And if history is just that cycle repeated at larger and larger scales, then one day the collapse will not just take down an empire. It will take down everything. It is disturbing because it makes progress look like an illusion. We tell ourselves humanity learns. We point to science, democracy, medicine, technology. We convince ourselves that the arc bends toward justice. Augustine's vision cuts through all of that. He says sin does not evolve away. It mutates, it disguises itself, but it never leaves. Pride is just as alive in our skyscrapers and space programs as it was in Rome's temples. Greed is just as present in digital finance as it was in ancient markets. Violence is just as creative, only now multiplied by nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence. Augustine's cycle does not slow with time. It accelerates. Psychology backs this up in chilling ways. Studies of power show that corruption is not rare, it is predictable. Give someone authority, and their empathy begins to drop, their sense of entitlement grows, their willingness to exploit others increases. This is not a flaw of certain leaders. It is a pattern of human behavior. Augustine would point and say, exactly, the cycle is not out there in history books. It is inside you, inside me, inside everyone. That is why no system lasts, because the rot begins in the human heart and spreads outward until the structure collapses. History is one long validation of this view. The Roman Empire, consumed by decadence. The Mayans, undone by overreach. Colonial empires, collapsing under greed and violence. Every age thinks it has finally solved the puzzle of order, only to repeat the same fall. Even the 20th century, the so-called century of progress, gave us world wars, genocide, and nuclear terror. Every achievement is shadowed by sin. Augustine would say that is the proof, not the exception. But here is the paradox. Augustine did not teach despair. He taught that the cycles of sin could not be broken by human effort alone, but only by divine grace. That was his escape hatch. Without God, collapse is destiny. With God, redemption is possible. But if you strip out the theology and look at the cycle from a secular lens, you are left with a terrifying conclusion: there may be no escape. Humanity might be trapped in a self-destructive loop that eventually scales up into extinction. And yet, maybe Augustine's insight still carries something useful even outside theology, because he forces us to stop pretending that systems alone will save us. Technology cannot erase pride. Democracy cannot erase greed. Science cannot erase violence. If extinction really is a sinful cycle reaching its final turn, then maybe the only hope is not new systems, but a transformation in human character. Something deeper than rules and structures. Something that changes the heart itself. But here is the tease that lingers. If Augustine was right, then maybe collapse is not a bug, but a feature. Maybe the cycle itself is the only constant, repeating until the very end. Which leaves us with a haunting question. Are we living in just another spin of the wheel, destined to crash like Rome and Babylon, and every empire before us? Or are we living in the final cycle, the one where human pride and sin do not just topple cities, but erase the species itself? Augustine does not give us comfort here. He only reminds us that history does not forget, and neither does the heart.